it's your favorite NPC, and today I will teach you Photoshop. In this course, you will learn everything you need to start making anything you like using Photoshop. This is what an image could look like without Photoshop. But with Photoshop, it could look like this, or like this, or like this. I've been using Photoshop since almost 15 years now, and it took me a very long time to figure everything out. But I don't think that it has to take that long. Therefore, I designed this course to teach you everything you need to know about Photoshop, from setting up Photoshop to understanding the fundamental concepts and even color theory. And along the way, we will build some projects together. I will show you how to change colors, design modern, professional thumbnails, and edit portraits from scratch. This course is designed for anyone who wants to learn Photoshop. So even if you are a complete beginner, you will be perfectly fine. So let's get started, guys. Adobe Photoshop is a professional image editing and design software that has become the standard for working with digital visuals. It started as a simple photo editing tool, but quickly evolved into a powerful system used for everything from photography to graphic design and digital art. Most basic editors only let you adjust brightness or add filters, but Photoshop gives you full control. Its layer-based workflow allows you to edit images non-destructively, combine multiple elements, and create complex designs step by step. Whether you are retouching a portrait, creating a thumbnail, or building a complete composition, Photoshop lets you shape every detail exactly how you want. Today, Photoshop is used by photographers, designers, and content creators to create everything from simple edits to highly detailed visuals. It's especially important for social media, marketing, and anything where strong visuals matter. You should learn Photoshop because it gives you complete control over your images, helps you create professional level designs, and is one of the most essential tools for anyone working with visual content. Installing Photoshop takes around 2 minutes. If you already have it, you can of course skip this chapter. If you don't have it yet, go to Google and enter Creative Cloud Download. So let's click this right here, and then you can just go to Creative Cloud Software Download or something like this. Right here, I'm going to select United States. This likely won't happen for you. And now you can just press Download Creative Cloud right here. This will download the Creative Cloud for you right here. So we are going to wait for the setup to finish. Once done, we can open it by clicking on it. And now you just have to press continue right here. This will take a short time and then it will open Creative Cloud for you. If you're not logged in at the moment, you essentially have to log in or create an account. If you want to use Photoshop in the English version, which I recommend because this tutorial and most tutorials are in English, then you have to set your Creative Cloud language to English. In order to do so, you can click this profile icon, then you can go to Preferences, and right here you have the Language tab, and for the language right here, and this language right here, I recommend you to select English. So you can open the drop-down menu, select English, and then you can just press Done essentially. And now we can go over to Apps, right here. And right here you can see a lot of different apps that the Adobe Creative Cloud allows you to install by just clicking a single button. So Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, Premiere, and so on. If you already have the app, then you will see an Open button. If you don't have the app yet, then you see this Install button. And for you, you will likely have the Install button for Photoshop. So you can just press this Install button right here. This will install Photoshop, and once you have it, you can press Open and open Photoshop like so. Instead, you can also go to your search bar and just search for Adobe Photoshop, for example. Then you can press this icon right here, and this should open Photoshop for you on your desktop. When you first open Photoshop, this is the interface that you're going to see. And most of this is never needed, so there only exist a couple of important areas. One of those important areas is the Recent Files area right here, where you can see a lot of your recent files. So in case you just want to keep working on a recent file, you can just open it here by clicking on the file, for example. If you want to see all of your files, you can also go to Your Files section right here. And right here you will see a lot of files, so you can just open it right here by clicking on the file, for example. But that's something that you will not need if you start Photoshop for the first time, because of course you will not have any files. So let's go back to the home page right here. So now you want to create your first project. In order to do so, you can just press the new file button right here, and this will open this area right here where you can select your aspect ratio. And right here you can define the width and the height of your file. And right now, as a unit, we are using pixels. In case you don't know what pixels are, I will explain it later on to you. But for now, you can just use a width of 1920 pixels and a height of 1080 pixels. That is a normal Full HD aspect ratio, and an aspect ratio that you will also use for thumbnails on YouTube, for example. I will create the file and then you will understand what this means. So now this is our file. And this file has a width of again 1920 pixels and a height of 1080 pixels. Let me just go on File, New, to create a new file. And now our current file has a horizontal orientation, as you can see. So right here you can select the orientation, but you could also use a vertical orientation. So now the width is 1080 pixels and the height is 1920 pixels. So let's press create right here. And now we have a vertical orientation. So the exact same aspect ratio, we just switched height and width. For YouTube thumbnails, for example, you mostly want to use a horizontal aspect ratio. For portraits, for example, you mostly want to use a vertical aspect ratio. You can also press File, New, to get to the exact same layout again. And right here, you can also see a lot of common aspect ratios. If you click on Web, for example, you will see a lot of common aspect ratios for web development. Right here, you can go to mobile and you will see a lot of common aspect ratios for mobile development and so on. So aspect ratio essentially just means the width and the height, and essentially the correlation between width and height. If you have more width than height, for example, you have a horizontal orientation. If you have more height than width, you have vertical orientation. Now, to navigate between different files, you can navigate between them right here. So right here at the top, you have all of your files. This here's your first file. This here's your second file. Now you could also create a third file, for example, by pressing New. So File, New, and now we could create another vertical file, for example. So let's just create it right here. And now we have another vertical file right here. Now you've already seen that you can create a new file by going to File, New, and just selecting the file here, so the aspect ratio, and pressing Create. Now you can also save your files by going to File, Save As, like so. And now you can select the location for your file. So I could, for example, save it on your desktop, give it a name, so cool PS file. And now I could just press Save. And this would save the file on my desktop. So let's go to my desktop. And right here, we have the file cool PS file, as you can see. Let's go back to Photoshop. Let me close this right here. Let me close this right here. And let me close this right here. Let me go to the desktop. Let me double click this. And you can see we reopened it inside of Photoshop. We can also save it to the Creative Cloud though. And the Creative Cloud is essentially just a storage that Photoshop provides for us in the cloud. So it's not on our desktop, but it's instead on Photoshop servers. So we don't have to store them on our desktop and can always select them anytime, as long as we have internet access. So save as, once again. Now we can say cool PS file. And now I'm going to save to Adobe Cloud right here. So let's press this. We can select that we want to save it to your files. So to my files essentially. I'm going to give it the name cool PS file again, like so. And now I'm going to press save, like so. So now we saved it to our Creative Cloud files. I'm going to close it right here. And you can see right now, within our recent folder, we also have cool PS file. And if I'm going to go to your files, I'm also having cool PS file. And even if I'm going to delete this file right here, so it's not on our desktop anymore, I will still be able to open it because it's stored inside of the Creative Cloud. So this is how you can create a file and how you can save a file. If you remember, once we go to File, New, to create a new file, there are not only pixel units. You can also select inches, centimeters, millimeters, points, pickers, and so on. And centimeters and millimeters might make sense if you want to print later on paper, for example, because then you can select the exact amount of millimeters or centimeters that a certain paper has, for example, and it will look good when printing. But most of the times you will use pixels, especially when you work with digital products. or I want to create YouTube thumbnails, and so on. So that is the common unit. But what exactly are pixels? Let me explain that to you. When you think about your PC monitor looks somewhat like this, for example. So probably not the best drawing, but I think you get the idea. So this is your monitor. And your monitor has a certain width. So a certain width right here. And it also has a certain height, like so. And now, even though you don't really see it, everything on your monitor is made up of pixels. And pixels look like this. They just look like squares. So you have one pixel right here, another one right here, another one right here, another one right here. And all of this works for the entire row like so. And the same, of course, also for the columns. So your entire monitor is essentially made up of squares, of those squares. And in the end, you have a lot of those squares. And all of those squares together form the image that you can see on the monitor. If you see a face, for example, on the screen, you just have a lot of pixels that make up this face. And if you add thousands of pixels to this monitor, you will not be able to see the individual pixels anymore. And to your eye, it will seem as if it is just a normal image, even though the image consists of thousands of pixels and every single pixel has its own color. So maybe this pixel has this color, this pixel has this color, this pixel has this color, and so on. But maybe another pixel, so this pixel, for example, is yellow, and this pixel might be yellow, and so on. So I think you get the idea. And if you say my aspect ratio should be 1920 pixels times 1080 pixels, then it means you have 1920 pixels of width and 1080 pixels of height, for example. So your entire image is made up of 1920 pixels times 1080 pixels. And if you're now going to take a calculator, you can also calculate the amount of pixels that your image is made up of by just using the width times the height, like so. And that is the amount of pixels that your image is made up of. So over 2 million pixels in this case, because you have 1080 rows and 1920 columns. Let me also show you a minimalistic example. And I think this image is really good to visualize how this works. Right here, the pixels are pretty big, so I don't have that many pixels. Nevertheless, you're able to say that this here is a face. And if you now think about adding more and more pixels to it, it would just get sharper and sharper up to the point where your brain can't even tell anymore that the image is made up of pixels. So that is how this works. So let's get back to Photoshop and let me show this to you by just using a very small width and a very small height. So let me use 10 pixels, for example, times 10 pixels. So in total, we now have 100 pixels of space on our entire image, like so. You can see this here is really small, so we gotta zoom in. Let me now use the brush. You don't need to understand the brush yet, but let me make this super small, this brush, which will probably take a short time because it's so big. And now I can just draw those individual pixels. So first pixel, second pixel, third pixel, fourth pixel, fifth, sixth, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So I can see we have 10 pixels into every single direction. And now, of course, we could also draw something like a head. I don't know. I think you get the idea. And we don't have a lot of pixels, so our head would probably look something like this. Now we also could have the body and so on. So I think you get the idea. If I would now add a lot more pixels, for example, though, so let's use 1000 times 1000, like so, you can see that it already looks a lot sharper. So always remember that when creating a new file. So now this here is your normal workspace, and we will go over all of the tools step by step. But in case you ever get lost or don't have the exact same workspace that I'm having, then you can always go to Window, Workspace, and you can just go to Reset Essentials. And this will reset your workspace to the default workspace. So Reset Essentials, and you just have the exact same. Let me show you how this works. I'm just going to rearrange something. Maybe I'm going to make this here bigger. And now I'm going to go to Window, Workspace, reset essentials, and you can see it just resetted our workspace. And it might happen from time to time that you just move something to the wrong location or close something that you didn't want to close, and then you can always reset it like this. And those were the most important things you need to know about the workspace. So let's create a new file. So new file, I'm going to take an aspect ratio of 1920 by 1080. I'm going to create a file. And now let's take a look at all of the different tools, the basic tools that Photoshop provides you to create your image or manipulate your image. So you will see a lot of important tools right here inside of the toolbar right here. And now let me show you the most important ones, top to bottom. So let's start by understanding the move tool, like so. At the moment, we cannot move anything. And the reason for this is that our background at the moment is locked. So right here, you can see your layers, but we'll go over layers later on. But for now, just understand that this here is the only layer that we have at the moment, and that is our background layer. So now, if you have this indicator right here, so this lock symbol, then this layer is locked, so we cannot manipulate it. So let's unlock this by just pressing the lock sign. And now we will be able to move this layer, for example. So you can just select the move tool and you can now move the layer, as you can see. And you will also get those outlines if you move the layer, which you can use to resize your image, for example. So right here, you can resize them and keep the aspect ratio. So the correlation between width and height will always stay the same. You can also use them here and the same happens and so on. Now you could press Shift though, and now you can also only scale one side. So now we are only scaling horizontally, and if I would press Shift and move this point right here, then we would only scale vertically like so. So if you're just taking this and moving it like this, you will contain the aspect ratio. If you're pressing Shift and moving, you can only scale vertically or horizontally. And if you hover over the icon right here, you can also see the shortcut. So to get the move tool, you can also just press V. So let me just press anywhere else. Let me select a different tool. And now if I'm going to press V, I can use the move tool, click on the layer. Once we move it or click on the layer, we will get those outlines and we can scale it again. So the move tool is really, really important and you will use it a lot. The next tool is this tool right here. All it really is a selection tool. So you can essentially use it to select something. So we could, for example, go here, select this area right here, and now we could copy and paste this in, for example. So I could press Ctrl C to copy. And now we could also, after we've copied it, just press Ctrl V to paste it in. And now we've created a new layer right here. Again, you don't need to understand them, but we have a new layer right here. If you take a look, I can deactivate the bottom layer. And now you can see our top layer only includes the content that we've previously selected and copy pasted. So we can again select a certain area. We can again press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and this will again copy paste our selection in. If I'm going to deactivate the bottom layer, we again see our selection. But let me delete those layers for now. So we can just delete those layers by pressing delete like so. And let's make our bottom layer visible again. Now we have this layer. If you're now going to click this for a longer time, you can see a couple of different selection tools. So you can also use an ellipse selection tool, for example. So now you could just select something that has the form of an ellipse, for example, and this works the exact same. Again, we could press Ctrl C, Ctrl V to copy paste something in. Let me make the bottom layer invisible, and you can see we now have this ellipse. If you want to create a perfect circle, so let me just delete this layer on top. And now to create a perfect circle, you're just going to drag, but at the same time, you're going to press Shift. And this will allow you to create a perfect circle like this. And of course, you can also test those bottom tools right here, but to be honest, I've never seen anyone use it and I've never used it myself, so you can test them yourself if you want to. The next tool that is really important is this tool right here. So the polygon lasso tool. And if you take a look at the preview, you already see what it does. It allows you to essentially select something from an image, for example. So let me also show you how to import an image, so we can also test it out. You can just go to the location where you have your image. So for example, inside of a folder, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. And now maybe I want to import this image right here. So this JPG image or PNG image in this case. I can just take the image and drag it into Photoshop. And you can see it will create a new layer right here that contains our image. So now the top layer includes this image and the bottom layer is still our white circle or white rectangle in this case. So let's again the top layer visible, and by using this eye icon right here, you can make it invisible or visible. So I think I forgot to mention that. So now we can, for example, cut something out right here, like so. Let's close the selection like this, and you can see it will create a selection around our foot. And now we could, for example, use Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V again to make a copy of this shoe. Let's make our bottom layers invisible, like so. And you can see we only have our shoe right here. Also, since I didn't mention that previously, you can go up and down by just using your scroll wheel on the mouse. And you can go left and right by pressing Ctrl and using your mouse wheel on the mouse. So a scroll wheel on the mouse like this. And you can press Alt and scroll on the mouse to zoom in and out like this. So Alt and scroll wheel is really important because it allows you to zoom in to the position where your mouse is currently. So if I'm going to move my mouse to the top left, for example, and I'm going to hold Alt and scroll, it will zoom to that position. And now I can zoom out again, get my mouse to the bottom right. I'm going to hold Alt and zoom on my mouse wheel again, and we're going to zoom in there. So that is something that is really important, especially for the selection, for example, because now we can zoom in on the shoe and get a much better selection. So now let me delete the top layer again, that only includes our shoe. And now we are working on this layer that includes our image, so this layer. And now I can try to select this shoe, for example, like this. The selection is still not perfect, but I would say that it's a lot better already than the selection that we did previously. And let me just make this a little bit faster because it does not need to be perfect. But I think you get the idea. Now we can just get the path for this entire shoe. Let's close this. And now we have a selection once again. Again, we could press Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V to copy, paste it in, but I'm not going to do that for now. Now that you've seen the polygon lasso tool, let me also introduce you to probably some of the most important tools in Photoshop, which is this tool right here. So Object Selection Tool, Quick Selection Tool, and Magic Wand Tool. Let's start by taking a look at the Object Selection Tool. And that one is really crazy because it allows you to essentially select a certain object from an image. So now we have this image, and you can see if I hover over a certain area, it already highlights the area. So now Photoshop tries to detect for you which area belongs together. So now right here it says, for example, that the shoe will be recognized as an individual object that could belong together. So now you can just press on the shoe and it will create a selection around the shoe for you. So now it did all of the stuff that we've done previously on our own on itself. And now I could again just press Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V to create or to get only those shoes, as you can see. But let's go back to our original layer. Let's delete the top layer that only includes our shoes. And let me show you the real power of that tool, for example. So now imagine we wanted to select the entire person. We could now just drag this tool over our entire person like so. So create a square around our person. And now Photoshop will load and will automatically recognize the object that is within this area essentially. And now we could take or could just copy, paste this person in. And now we just have this person right here. Of course, the mask is not perfect at the moment, but we'll learn how to correct this later on. So I think you get the idea. So let's delete this. Let's get back to the original layer. And now we could also use this to, for example, just create a small rectangle for our shoes. And now it will only select one shoe. Or we could only create a rectangle over our floor, and you will see it does its best to select the floor. I can also try to get the shadow, like so, and it will try to get the shadow. So that tool is really powerful, especially for selecting things really fast. Again, to get rid of this mask, we can just go over to the selection tool and press anywhere. Now let's go back to this tool right here. Let's press on this for a longer time. And let's switch over to the quick selection tool. So this tool right here. And now let's zoom in again by pressing Alt and zooming in. So scrolling on the mouse wheel. And let's try to get this trouser, for example. And now we can just use this circle, for example, to move over the areas that we want to select. And it will do its best to automatically select what we are looking for. Like so, for example, like so. Let's also select this part, and it does. And let's also try to get the hoodie, for example, like so, and the arm, and maybe a little bit of this. And you can see now we've only selected the hoodie, essentially, so the clothing. Of course, we could also add the face, like so. So that is up to you. Now, if you wanted to remove something from the selection, you could press Alt, and now you will see inside of the button, or inside of the brush, essentially, we don't have a plus anymore. Once we press Alt, we have a minus right there. And now we can use this minus to just move over the selection and get rid of a little bit from what we've already selected, like so. And this is really important for selecting stuff properly. And now, as already mentioned, we can just press Ctrl C, Ctrl V again, and we have this result essentially. Let me delete this, and let's make our layer visible once again. And let's go on to the next tool, which is the Magic Wand tool. And this one essentially just tries to select something automatically. So I'm just going to press into the shadow, for example, and it tries to select something. And the selection is terrible. Why is the selection terrible? Because our tolerance is super high at the moment. So now you have to play with the tolerance a little bit and make it a little bit lower, for example. And you can see now it tries to select the shadow. Let's make it a little bit higher. Now it selects a little more of the shadow. And the higher the tolerance, the more of something it will select. So if the tolerance is super low, it will essentially just select the color that you clicked essentially. So probably this color right here. If I'm now going to increase the tolerance, it will tolerate a little more difference essentially between the colors that we've clicked. So I'm going to click this, and you can see it tolerates a lot more difference between the colors. And I'm going to adjust it or make it a little bit higher once again, and you can see it will tolerate even more. And now we have a pretty good selection, I would say already. But now once I'm going to go too high, for example, so let's try this, you can see the selection already gets a little worse. Now we can also go super high like so, and you can see it literally selects the entire image. So it doesn't really care anymore. And the same, of course, also works for the clothing like so. So let's use a lower tolerance and start with that. You can see it pretty much doesn't select anything. Let me increase that one. You can see it selects a little more. Let me increase this once again. And it selects even more. And again, it selects even more. Let me increase this. And you can see now it selects a lot. And from time to time, especially for selecting stuff that is pretty similar, this tool can be really helpful. But for stuff like a person, for example, you might prefer the object selection tool or the quick selection tool. So every single tool has its purpose under different circumstances. Let me now also show you a scenario where this Magic Wand tool is really useful. So I don't think that it's useless. So let's go to Google and let's search for a black circle on white background, for example. So now let's just select this one. Let's right click the image, copy image right here. And now we can just paste it in by pressing Ctrl V right here. And now imagine I only want to have the black circle and I want to remove all of the white. So now I can just select the layer first of all. So it's important that the layer with the circle is selected. Now we can just press the white background right here. And now we can just press delete, for example. So delete on your keyboard, and that will delete everything that we selected. And for getting things like this, so things like black on a white background, so things that are very easy to separate, the Magic Wand tool can be really useful. Let's now take a look at the next important tool, and that is the eyedropper tool. So let's go over this tool right here. Let's click it to select it. And now imagine you want to have a random color from this image. So maybe we want to have this purple color right here. Now, by using the eyedropper tool, we can just click this color right here. And now we'll see in the color palette right here to the left, we have selected this color. I can also select a different color and you will see that this color right here will change. So let me click this dark purple right here. And you can see we now have a dark color. But let me go back to the light version like so. And now I have essentially selected this color right here. In Photoshop, you always have a primary color and a secondary color. And you will use the primary color by default, but you can also select a secondary color as a backup. So now we could use switch foreground and background color right here. So this symbol right here to switch those colors. We could again use the eyedropper tool and now select a dark version of purple, for example. And now we have this dark version as a foreground color currently and this light version as a background color currently. Now we can switch them and now we have those colors saved essentially. And later on, or in a second, you will see how we can use them. So let's use them. And in order to do so, we can use the brush tool. So right here, this is the brush tool. Essentially, this is just a brush that you can use to draw onto an image, for example. So now I could, for example, draw, and you will see by default, we are going to use the foreground color. We can also change foreground and background color and then draw. And now we will again use the darker color. So the foreground color, the current one. So by using the eyedropper, you can select a couple of colors, to be precise, 2 colors. And then you can switch between those colors if you're drawing, for example, like so. If you want to undo something, so get back to the old state, you can always press Ctrl Z, like so. And this will undo something that you've done, like so. So now you can see at the moment, this brush tool is very hard. But there's also a possibility to change the size of the brush tool and to change the hardness of the brush tool. If you press the Alt key and right click on your mouse and move to the left or to the right, you can make it bigger or smaller. So Alt plus holding right mouse click and then moving left to right will increase or decrease the size of a brush, like so. And Alt clicking, right clicking and moving upwards or downwards will decrease or increase the hardness of a brush. So if you move upwards, you will make it softer. If you move downward, you will make the brush harder. So let's move upwards and let me show you the softer brush. And you can see this one is a lot softer now. We can again move downwards and make the brush a little bit harder. And now we have a pretty hard brush, as you can see. Let me revert this like so. And let's now also take a look at the pencil tool. So I can just again hold on this brush tool for a long time. And then you can also see the pencil tool, for example. I literally never use it, but in case you want, you can use it like this. And then you can just draw something right here. Again, alt clicking, right clicking, and moving right or left will make it bigger or smaller, like so. And again, alt clicking, right clicking, and moving upwards and downwards will make it softer or harder, like so. But you can see for this brush, the softness doesn't really change too much. And usually I always use the brush, and I think for most of you, the brush is always the tool of your choice. Now, in case you want to get rid of a certain area, you can also use the erase tool like this. So this is the eraser. And now you can just erase something and you will see you erase it from the currently selected layer. So in our case, from this photo right here. So I can erase it like so. And then you will always see the layer below. And currently we have this white layer below and this transparent background. So if I'm going to erase pretty much everything, you will see that we are going to see the square and our transparent background. So the eraser is pretty simple. You just delete something from an image. But let me revert this as well, like so. Let's now take a look at the gradient tool right here. And this allows you to create a gradient. What is a gradient? I think it's easiest to just show it to you. So let me move from left to right. And you can see this is a gradient. A gradient usually includes 2 or more colors and essentially fades from one color to another. In our case, we have brown and a darker version of brown. We can change the gradient by clicking here, for example, or here. So that is up to you. and then you can, for example, go to basics and you can just select a different gradient. So right here you have a basic gradient, a purple blue gradient. You can also go to blues, you can go to purples, and so on. So Photoshop provides a lot of pre-selected gradients already. But of course, you can also create your own gradient. In order to do so, you can just click this point right here, go over there, and then you can, for example, choose a color like so. You can go to the second point like so, and you can also choose a color like so. And now you have this type of gradient. An alternative way would also be to just click in here, and then you can also adjust your gradient if you want to. There exist a couple different ways, or a couple different gradients to be precise. The first one is the linear gradient. So that is essentially a line from left to right, from top to bottom. So that is up to you, or can also be like this. So again, that is up to you. But you can also have a radial gradient, for example, which is essentially just a radius, as you can imagine, like so. So then the gradient starts in the middle and goes outwards into every single direction, like so. Then we also have this gradient right here, this gradient, and this gradient. But I'm going to be honest, you will mostly use the linear gradient and from time to time, maybe the radial gradient. Let me also choose a preset right here. And if you now go to the right tab right here, again, you can also switch between linear, radial, and all of those other gradients if you want to. And you can also change the angle right here, but mostly that's not really necessary. You can just drag those points right here. And I think that is a little bit easier. But something that is kind of nice right here is that you can also click the midpoint right here. And this essentially defines how the gradient is going to behave, or where exactly we're going to have the transition between those two colors. So I can, for example, say I want to have a lot of this dark blue and then only a little bit of this purple right here. And then you can just drag this midpoint right here, and this will define where the transition between those two colors is going to happen. You could also move this point right here or this point right here. So that's up to you. And you can also just duplicate this point right here, for example, by pressing Alt, like so, and then moving that point to a different position. So Alt and moving essentially. And that will create more points. And of course, you can give those points a different color as well. So we could also say, let me give this point maybe the color yellow. It looks absolutely terrible, but I think you get the idea. We can also make this one green and blue and whatever you like, essentially. Let's say this here is red. So I think you get the idea. You can add as many points as you like, and then you can adjust the colors. So let me again delete this layer right here. To delete something, you can use this trash icon. Yes, and this will delete a layer, but we'll go over this later on. Let's now take a look at a pretty important tool, and that is the pen tool right here. Shortcut is also P, as you can see. So I can just press P and I will select the pen tool, or you click this little icon right here. And the pen tool is pretty useful if you want to cut out a certain thing, but you need to be really, really precise. So imagine the shoe, for example. Similar to the polygon tool right here, we can now create a starting point, and now we can just cut out our shoe, for example. But something that is pretty nice about the pen tool now is that we can also do curves. If we hold a line, for example, and now move our cursor upwards, for example, we can create a curved line like so. So you see this point here is curved. Now I can also press Alt and I can move this point right here or this point right here. And this here will create how curved this line is. So essentially the line between those 2 points. And this one here defines how curved the next line that we are going to create is going to be. So, of course, if I'm going to create a point like this, you can see it looks pretty curved. But I don't want to have it curved into this direction. Maybe I want to have it curved into this direction. So I'm going to move this point here next. And now I can just keep going like so. So I can cut it out like this. And As you can see, by using the pen tool, I have a lot more control and it's a lot better to cut out curves, for example. You will always use the pen tool if it's really, really important that you get a perfect mask, essentially. So every time you want to do something super precise, you should use the pen tool yourself. I gotta say that object selection these days is really, really good. So Photoshop does a great job there. But from time to time, object selection or the automatic selection tools of Photoshop are not that great. And then you can always use the mask tools. So now I could also cut this out, but I think you get the idea. So let me just make this really quick right now, so I'm not wasting too much time. And now you can always connect the path. So the last point and the first point have to meet, like so. And now you can see we have the selection. But at this point, we cannot do much with that selection. Or in order to really select the shoe now, we have to press Control, Enter. And you can see this will create a selection. And now we can, for example, press Control C, Control V to paste the shoe in again. And now we have this shoe right here selected, and you can do anything you like with that shoe now. But I'm going to delete it because I do not need it. So the mask tool, always great to cut something out. And of course, it would take a long time to cut out those hairs, for example. So it always depends on what you want to cut out. But for a couple of things, or to be precise, for a lot of things, this pen tool is really, really useful. Let's now take a look at the text tool. The text tool allows you to write text. So you can just click in there, for example. This will create a new text layer. And now you can write some text. So hello guys, for example, like this. And you can see here to the right, under properties, we can select a lot of stuff about our text. We can select a different font. So we can just go through a lot of fonts like this. And maybe I want to use something like Roboto, for example. So now I could select Roboto Blue. Hello guys, like this. Now I want to have a different text size. So I'm just going to click on this text icon and make it bigger by dragging to the right, or smaller by dragging to the left. So that is up to you. If you would have a couple of lines like so, you could also adjust the spacing between those lines by dragging to the right again or to the left, like so. You could adjust the letter spacing by using this icon right here. And you can, of course, also adjust the color. So you can select any color you like right here by dragging this cursor around. And for now, let's just choose black, for example, like this. Actually, you can also add a couple of styles by using those type options, like so. So this, for example, means capital letters. And I have not really used a lot of the other stuff, but you can have this, for example, so an underline. You can have a line through. So that is up to you. If you scroll down a little bit further, you can also decide whether your text should be aligned to the left, to the right, or centered, for example. So now let me also delete this text and let's take a look at the next important tool, which is going to be the shape layer. So let's press the shape layer and let's just create a basic shape. And you can see again to the right, we can decide how this shape should look like. Right here, under fill, we can select a color by clicking this icon right here. So fill, this one, and then clicking this color icon. And now we can select a color for our rectangle, for example, like so. And we can also say that we don't want to have a fill at all by pressing this icon right here. So now we don't have a fill, and by selecting color again, we will have a fill again, like so. We can also add a stroke to our rectangle by adding a stroke right here. So right here we can define the stroke width in pixels by dragging the slider to the right or to the left. Let's drag it to the right. And now we can also change the stroke color by pressing this color icon right here. And again, we can define no stroke, or we can define a stroke by choosing a color, for example, like so. Right here, you can also define whether the stroke should be outside, for example, or inside, for example. So that is up to you. And this is just normal, so in between essentially. You can define how the borders should look like by doing so, for example. You probably barely see the difference. And if you want to get round borders, the easiest way is probably to use those points right here. So you can move them to the center and then you will get a rounded version, or you can move them outward and then you will get a less rounded version. So moving it inward to get a rounded version, moving it outward to get a less rounded version. You can also only make one side rounded by pressing Alt and moving one single dot, essentially, like so. There exist a lot of different shapes, so I can also use an ellipse tool, for example, like so. Again, holding Shift will create a perfect ellipse, and if you're not holding Shift, you can create any ellipse you like. So just normal use of the ellipse tool will create a normal ellipse. Ellipse together with Shift will create a perfect circle, like this. You could, of course, also use a triangle. You could use a polygon, like so. You can also use a star. So I think you get the idea. You can do all kinds of shapes by using this tool right here. A line, of course, works as well, and so on. And every single shape will create a new layer. Again, you don't need to understand this, but you can see all of those layers right here. For now, let me select all of them by selecting the bottom one, holding Shift and selecting the top one. This will select everything in between. And now I'm going to press Delete on my keyboard. The next tool is going to be the hand tool. That one is pretty unnecessary in my opinion. You can use it by using H though, like so, and then you can drag your image around. I'm not really using it too much because I'm always using Alt to zoom out and then Alt to zoom in on the position where I need to go. But of course, instead, you could also use H, so the hand essentially. So I can just press on the hand and then use it, or you can just press H on your keyboard and then use it. And something that you might do pretty often is switch between V, which will select the move tool, and H, which will select the tool to move around or navigate around on your layer, like so. But again, I usually use the zoom tool together with the move tool. And now there also exists the zoom tool, so I can just click it, click it, click it, and you will zoom in every time you click the layer. And you can also press Alt, and now you can see the plus turns into a minus, and you can click, 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 and you will zoom out. But again, I usually just hold Alt, and then I use the mouse wheel to zoom in or to zoom out. So that would be my recommended way. And now, in my opinion, those are the most important tools. I've never really used another tool besides the patch tool, but we'll take a closer look at that one later on. That one is kind of important if you want to do portraits. But again, I'll explain it later on. So if you know those tools for now, you're really, really good to go. Let me now introduce you to layers. We've already seen a couple of layers. So this here, for example, is one layer. This here is one layer. So I can see all of your layers right here to the right. To create a new layer, you can use the plus icon like so, and you can see it created a new layer, and this layer has the name layer 1. You can just double click this name and now you can rename it. So I could say, for example, this is the layer that includes drawings. And now I could, for example, use the brush tool right here and I could draw over this image, for example. So now I have this circle. And now I can turn on and off the layer by using this eye symbol right here. And you can see if I turn off this layer, it's now invisible and we're only seeing the layer below. And if I turn it on, it's visible again. So essentially when using Photoshop, you layer your stuff and then you can turn on or off a layer to get rid of it or turn it on again essentially. And the benefit of this is that you now can't destroy your original photo. So imagine you would draw onto this image and then you would draw here and here and here. And maybe you don't like this one. It's now not really possible to just take the eraser and erase this because now your image is essentially lost forever. But the benefit of using a layer is that you can now have all of your drawings on this layer right here. And maybe at a certain point, I don't like this drawing right here anymore. And now I can just take the eraser and erase on this image, on this layer to be precise. So I have to select this layer. And now I can erase on this layer. And you can see the original layer is still there. And I only erase on this layer. And when using Photoshop, you, for example, use one layer for text, one layer for drawings, one layer for masks, one layer for shapes, and so on. And if you remember, every time we create a new text, for example, we also add a new layer. So hello, like so. Now to create a new text, I have to click somewhere else. So I click this layer, and now I'm just going to click in here, and you can see we created a new text layer. Hello again. Now I have to deselect this text somehow. So I'm going to press this layer again, and I'm going to press here again, and hello once again. So I can see every time we create a new text, we are also creating a new layer. And now we can turn on and off this text by just using those eye icons. And we can also delete individual layers. So I can delete this one. Let me make them visible. And I can also delete this one and even this one if I wanted to. So I think you get the idea. And let me also delete this one. And let me also try to delete this one. And you can see I cannot delete the last layer. So you always have to have at least one layer. And if I'm now going to create a new layer, I can now delete the last layer, like so. Now there also exists one tool that I didn't show you up to this point. It's not that important, but maybe you want to use it from time to time. And that is the paint tool right here. So I can select it, just press on the layer, and it will essentially fill the entire layer with the color that you've selected for your foreground color right here. So maybe I want to use pure black, and now I can just add pure black right here. And now if I wanted to draw onto this layer, I can just create a new layer, for example. Maybe this layer here is going to be my background, so I rename it to background. Now I can take my brush. Let me select a different color. Maybe I want to create grass right here. So I'm going to create grass, like so. Let me now create the midground. So midground. And now I'm going to create a house, for example, like so. So I just take this one. For the fill color, I'm just going to use yellow. And for the stroke, I'm going to use no stroke. And now I can also create another shape, like so, by using a triangle. And now I have the house. We created a new layer for every new shape layer. That is something that is important to know as well. So every new shape, we create a new layer. So this here is going to be midground as well. And now I also want to have a foreground. So foreground. And let me create a person. That one should be a white stickman, for example. So like so. He has a big biceps, for example, like this. And now I want to show you how layers work. And I think you can already imagine, but the layer that is highest in the hierarchy will always be the layer to the front. So now I can also press Ctrl T, and that will allow me to select and resize the current layer. So if I'm going to press Ctrl T, you will see this box, and now I can use it to resize this layer right here, essentially. And I can also just press it, hold it, and move it to any position I like. And you can see it's always in front of all of the other layers. So it's in front of our midground, it's in front of our background, and so on. Now I can move a layer by just taking it, holding it, and moving it down, so below other layers. Let me move it below the background. And you can see now it's behind our background. Let me also move it right behind our house, for example. And if I'm now going to take it and go behind our house, you can see now our stickman is behind our house. So the layer on top is always the layer that is visible. So essentially the front layer. And the further down a layer is in the hierarchy, the further to the back it will also appear on the original image. So to summarize, the highest image in the hierarchy will always be to the front, and the image the furthest down in the hierarchy will always be to the back. If you select the layer, you will always get the possibility to resize it if you have the move tool selected, like so, and move it, of course, as well, like so. If you have a different tool selected, you can always go back to the resize mode by using Ctrl T, like so. And then you can just resize it the normal way and move it the normal way. So Ctrl T is really important, and understanding the hierarchy is really important. You can also delete a layer by using this trash icon right here. So now it will ask you whether you want to delete the layer foreground. Now you can press yes. You can also press don't show again if you don't want to see this message again. That's up to you. I'm going to press yes and I'll delete it. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo this change. And now I also want to introduce you to folders. So maybe I want to group my midground right here, because maybe I want to apply a couple of changes to both of those elements at the same time. Or I just want to group this content to make my layers a little more organized. So that is up to you. But if you want to group content, you can just use this folder icon. And that one will move all of the selected items into this folder. You can now expand this folder like so, or minimize it like so. And if you expand it, you can see all of the items inside. So now you can select those items individually the way you would do normally, but you can also just select the entire folder. And now you can move the entire folder by pressing Ctrl T, and this will allow you to move the entire folder at once. And you can move all of this. If you just select the folder the normal way and press an item inside the folder, you can see that it will always only move the selected item. So if you want to move the entire folder at once, so every single item inside the folder, you always have to use Ctrl T first. And now you can see I can move the entire folder at once. So that is really important. Only selecting the folder will not give you the exact same possibilities as selecting the folder and then pressing Ctrl T, because only then you can move the entire folder at once. Now, to move an item outside of the folder, you just take the item and move it outwards, essentially, like so. And now only our midground is inside of the folder and the other midground is outside of the folder. Can move it back in, like so, and I could also move the background into this folder like so. So moving items in and outwards is really, really simple. And of course, the hierarchy matters as well. So if the background is in front of our folder, of course the background will also appear in front of our folder. So let's move it below our folder again, like so. If you select a certain layer, you can also change the opacity right here. So I can just adjust the transparency. So if you move this or lower this value, you can see that it gets a little more transparent. If opacity is 0, it's essentially invisible because it's fully transparent. And if opacity is 100, it's essentially completely visible, so it's not transparent at all. So by using opacity, you can change the opacity of a layer. And in case you see something like this or something like this, and you don't know how to get to your layers channel, it's most likely because you didn't select the layers channel right here. And I know this seems obvious, but when I first started, I sometimes got lost. So I want to mention this. And those were the most important things you really need to know about layers. Let's now understand the difference between transform and warp. If we now select a layer like so and press Ctrl T, you see that we get those options right here. And now we can also scale our layer. We can rotate it by getting to an edge right here with our cursor and then rotating it like this. And we can, of course, also move it like this. So we get all of those options once we press on a layer and then press Ctrl T. But now there also exists the possibility to warp a layer. And we can do so by right-clicking the selected layer and then selecting warp right here. And now you can see we get this grid right here. And we can, for example, move one of those points right here. And this will essentially just stretch or move this point and all of the other points of this layer. So we can get this one to the top. We can get this point to the top. We can also make those ones here longer, rotate them, and so on, which will essentially bend our grid. And I think you get the idea. We can also move those points right here, right here, right here. And as you can see, we can also use this to make this look or appear three-dimensional, like so, for example. So we could get this point over here, this point over here, this point over here, like so. So let's make this here straight. So I think you get the idea, even though it looks kind of weird at this point. But you can see now it looks three-dimensional. So I can use the warp to warp a layer in many different ways. And you can use transform to do some basic transformations. So Ctrl T to get access to transformations. So rotation, scaling, and moving. And right-click warp to get access to the warp tool. And for more circumstances, the normal transform tool is more than enough. Let's now understand the difference between erase and layer mask. First of all, let's delete all of those layers, and let me again open my Photoshop folder and just drag this image in there. And now, as we've already seen, you can just use the normal eraser tool to erase something from a certain image. And in case the eraser tool is blocked like this, so it can't erase anything, it's likely that your layer is a smart object. If that is the case, then you can right-click the layer like so, and then you have to press Rasterize Layer. You don't need to understand what a smart object is yet. Just remember, if you cannot erase, it's likely because of that. So you can just rasterize the layer, and now you can use the eraser tool. And you can see we're seeing the background, which is currently this black layer. Let me also delete the black layer like so. And now you can see we erase all of this stuff. And now it's not really possible to get back to the original image. Of course, we could press Ctrl Z, but there's not really a way to save the original image. So to, for example, paint on the layer and say, I want this to be invisible, for example, and this to be visible. So that's not possible. Let me show you what I mean by that, but just demonstrate. Again, let me delete the layer below. And now let's create a layer mask. We can create a layer mask by pressing on this small icon right here. So let's press on this one, and you can see now we have this layer mask right next to this layer right here. So this is what the layer mask looks like. And now we can draw onto this layer mask with a normal brush by using black and white. White essentially means this part of the image is visible, and black means this part of the image is invisible. And currently our complete layer mask right here is white, so everything is visible. But now we can, for example, draw over this part right here, and now you can see this part gets invisible. So this is pretty similar to the eraser, but what is the difference now? We can now switch between black and white and draw over this part, for example, with a white brush, and you can see this part now gets visible. So by using a layer mask, we can change what is visible and what is invisible all of the time. And there's no problem in getting back to one or another state. So now I could just make everything visible once again. And I could also make parts invisible again. So all of this is no problem. Also, if you wonder how I switch between white and black so fast, you can just use X on your keyboard, and you can see X will always toggle the foreground and the background color. So X will make this black, now X will make this white, and so on. So I think you get the idea. And this allows you to draw really, really fast on layer masks. And now something that is great about a layer mask is that you can also use a selection tool, for example, select a certain area. Now you can take the brush tool, take a black brush, for example, and just draw over all of this right here. And you can essentially make the entire selection invisible. But if you later on want to change something, you can again select a certain area. Let me take the brush. Let's switch back to white. And now I can make this part here visible, for example. And I think you get the idea. A layer mask is a super flexible way to decide which part of an image should be visible and which part shouldn't be visible. So if you have the possibility, and you usually have, then I would always recommend you to use a layer mask instead of the eraser. Let me now introduce you to clipping mask and blending mode. First of all, let me delete this right here. And let me also just create a new layer. Let me take the fill tool and let me just fill with a black background like so. Now imagine we have a basic shape, for example, this rectangle right here. So we create a new rectangle shape. Let's use a fill mode of yellow, for example, so we can see our rectangle like so. And now I'm going to create a new layer. And now I maybe want to create a white area right here. So I want to draw with a pen or with a brush to be precise onto this rectangle. But now every time I'm going to draw, I will also always draw over the background. So isn't there a possibility to say that this white drawing right here should only affect our rectangle? And in order to do so, we can use a clipping mask. And to create a clipping mask, you essentially move the layer right above the layer that you want to affect, So under those circumstances, we want the layer that includes our brush, so our drawing, to be right above the rectangle. Then we're going to hold Alt, and then you will see this arrow right between the layers. And if you're now going to left click, you can see that we created a clipping mask. So now this layer only affects the layer that it is clipping to. And in this case, this layer is only clipped to this rectangle layer. So whatever we draw on this layer will only be visible on our rectangle layer, like so. So now I can only draw onto my rectangle. And this here might seem unnecessary at first, but that is a really important concept in Photoshop that gets super important once you start to edit real photos. And you will understand why later on. Now in Photoshop, there also exist blending modes. In order to explain them to you, let me delete all of this for now. And let's go to Google and search for fire sparks, for example. Like so. Let's go over to images and let's get one of those images that is on a black screen, for example. It doesn't have to be good for this simple example, but I'm going to copy the image like so, and I'm going to paste the image right here. I'm now going to make it a little bit bigger, like this. You can see that it hides essentially everything. Isn't it now possible to say that I want everything that is black to be invisible, and I only want our fire and our sparks to be visible? And now we can use blending modes by going over to this tab, and now we can hover over the desired blending mode, and we will always see a preview of the selected blending mode. So this is what multiply would look like: color burn, linear burn, darken color, lighten, screen, color dodge, and so on. So you have a lot of different blending modes essentially that you can choose from, and every single one will change your layer in one way or another. So screen essentially says that black is going to be pretty much transparent and we're only going to see the fire essentially. And you can see this is what it looks like. Probably wouldn't be the best fit for this type of image, but I think you get the idea. Now we could also search for something on a white layer. So maybe we want to have particles, but we want to have a white background, like so. So let's, for example, search for black particles, white background, like so. So let's, for example, get those particles right here. Let's copy this image. Let's paste it in here. Actually, it didn't take the right image for whatever reason. So copy image, paste image, and now we have the right image right here. And now let me show you. Screen now wouldn't work because our background is white, and screen works better when you have a black background. But we can use overlay, for example, or soft light, hard light, vivid light. So most of them do not look pretty good, but you can go through all of those ones, and maybe at a certain point, divide, for example, you find a blending mode that looks kinda alright. So multiply would, for example, work as well. And by going through all of those blending modes, you find one eventually that works. And of course, I could explain every single blending mode and how color will be added or removed to you in detail, but actually I don't really feel like remembering those blending modes makes a lot of sense. And I actually pretty much don't know most of them myself. You can just test them out all of the time, and I think you will remember pretty quickly that screen, for example, works when you have a dark layer, so a black layer, for example, and something like multiply works when you have a white layer. And those ones are the most important blending modes anyways. From time to time, you might want to use some of those blending modes, but that's actually really, really rare. And a couple of them are also kind of self-explanatory. For example, if you use the blending mode color like so, you can see that you're just seeing the color on the image. I can also show you by just drawing something onto this image. Now I can use the blending mode color, and you can see now our image just has this type of color. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do, and I think you can just experiment with those blending modes. Again, 99% of the times you will probably use screen or multiply, because, for example, adding those flames is something that you might want to do from time to time. Or in general, adding something on a black background is something that you will do pretty often if you're manipulating your images. So to sum up, a blending mode defines how a layer visually mixes with the layers underneath. Let's now understand selections a little bit better. So we've already seen a couple of selections. So you can select something by using this tool, for example. You can select something by using the lasso tool, like so. You can select something by using this magic wand. You can select by using the pen tool, for example. So there are a lot of different ways to select a certain area. But now those selections get a lot better once you start to use them together with a mask, with a layer mask to be precise. So now that you've selected something, you can press this layer mask icon right here, and it will automatically create a layer mask where everything except the selected area will be black on the layer mask, and only the selected area will be white on the layer mask. And now this allows you to select something, get rid of everything that is not selected, but later on you can, for example, select something else like this, and you can always get back to this state by just using a white brush again. So using a layer mask together with a selection tool like so is something that is really powerful inside of Photoshop, as you can see. Because now you're able to select something, but you can always change the look and go backward or forward. So I just want you to know that this here is a really common workflow, and every time you want to go back to the original image, you can just delete the layer mask by selecting the layer mask. So right now the layer is selected, but now I can just click on the layer mask right here, and I can press delete, and this will only delete the layer mask. So now we have the original image again, and if I now wanted to select something once again, I could just do a selection, use the layer mask again, and now I have a new layer mask. If I don't like this layer mask again, I can just delete it like so. So that is something that is really powerful in Photoshop. Let me introduce you to the, in my opinion, coolest tool in modern Photoshop, and that is Generative Fill. So if you have a new version of Photoshop, you should be able to see this bar right here. And this bar, for example, allows you to select the subject, remove the background, adjust colors, and all of the stuff by using a single click. I also didn't use everything because there are so many features in Photoshop, and most of them are pretty unnecessary. But one that I use a lot is the remove background feature. So now I can just select my layer, press remove background. You can see it's loading, and it automatically detects the background and deletes everything that it recognizes as background. And now I could also just press generate background right here, now that I've removed the background like so. And now by using text, you can generate a background. So I could, for example, say sky, which obviously doesn't make sense at all. So this will probably look pretty terrible. But now it will try to generate a background from a text description. And you can see it took a short time, and now it created a sky background. I can also switch between different alternatives. So every time you use generate, it creates 3 versions for you. And now you can switch or toggle between those versions, as you can see. But maybe I will just say creative background. So now I think it will try to get something more creative, or it will come up with something in general. So let's take a look at that. And you can see now we have this creative background, and you can write pretty much anything you like. And by using text, you can essentially generate images. So that is really cool about Photoshop. Let me now delete this. Let me actually also delete the background. I don't need it anymore. So I delete the background image or the background layer. And I'm also going to get rid of the mask, because this tool is also a lot more powerful. So I can also just select something on this layer, and now I can use Generative Fill. So I can press Generative Fill, and right here we can again use text to generate image inside of the selected area, or to generate stuff inside of the selected area. So maybe I want to have a cola bottle over there. And now it again will take a short time. It uses Firefly to generate an image right here that fits to the rest of the layer, of the selected layer. And you can see once done, we now have this cola bottle, and we can choose between different versions, and we have all of those bottles right here. I can also delete this layer once again to get rid of the cola bottle. I can select this layer, and maybe I want to add a football right here. So I'm going to type in football like this, and now it will try to generate a football in this area that fits to the image. Again, this takes a short time, And you can see now we have this football right here. And in my opinion, this here looks really, really cool already. And Generative Fill allows you to create super creative stuff inside of Photoshop by using simple text prompts. And now I could also, for example, convert those layers to a smart object. You don't need to know what this is yet, but just let me show you how this works, or let me show you something cool. So now I could also say that I want to have some fire right here, for example. And now it will generate some fire. So now I use the pen tool. And now inside of this area, I'm essentially saying that I want to have some fire that fits the entire image. And now you can see we have this burning ball. And whether you like it or not is up to you. But I think this looks kind of right, so I'll leave it right here. So to sum up, you can use Generative Fill to generate creative stuff by using simple text prompts inside of Photoshop. And this is really cool if you think about thumbnails like Mr. Beast, because there you have a lot of creative stuff and a lot of special effects that add to the final look of the image. So that is something that I definitely want you to know. What do you feel when looking at this photo? Or this one? Or this one? Even though it's almost the same photo, the feeling you get from every single image is completely different. When editing photos or images, it's important to understand what color is and especially how color is perceived. Of course, every single person is slightly different, but there is a psychology behind every single color. If you wear a blue suit, people will perceive you differently than if you wear a red suit. And the same applies to images. That's why color psychology and knowing which colors work well together is crucial if you really want to create beautiful images. Before we talk about color psychology or color combinations, we first need to understand what color actually is inside a digital image. On a screen, every color is built from 3 channels: red, green, and blue. That's also what RGB stands for. And by mixing those channels, you can create almost every color you can see. For example, if you use only red, you get red. If you mix red and green, you get yellow. If you mix red and blue, you get purple. And if you mix red, green, and blue at full strength, you get white. If you mix red, green, and blue at 0 strength, you get black. And everything in between is just a mix of those 3 channels. But RGB is only the technical base. When we edit photos, we usually think about color in a more intuitive way. Here we look at 3 things: hue, saturation, and lightness. Hue means the actual color. Is it red? Is it blue? Is it green? Saturation means how strong or pure that color is. A highly saturated red looks intense and powerful. A low saturated red looks more faded, soft, and grayish. And lightness means how bright or dark the color is. So when adjusting a color, you are usually changing one of those 3 parameters. You can change the hue and turn a blue sky more towards a cyan or purple sky. You can increase the saturation and make the sky more intense, or you can lower the lightness and make it darker and more dramatic. And that is important, because the same color can appear completely different depending on those values. And once you understand that, photo editing becomes much more controlled. Because now you're not just randomly changing sliders, you understand what you're actually changing. But color is not just technical, it's also psychology. A 2025 review looked at 132 studies and found that people associate colors with emotion. One of the most important takeaways is this: the feeling of a color does not only depend on the hue. Lightness, saturation, and temperature matter too. Lighter colors tend to be linked to more positive emotions, while darker colors tend to be linked to more negative emotions. More saturated colors are usually linked with higher arousal and more intensity, and warmer hues overall tend to be more activating than cooler ones. So what does that mean in practice? Red usually feels intense. Depending on the context, it can read as passion, urgency, excitement, love, power, or anger. That is why red is great if you want emphasis and energy, but it's also the fastest color to become overwhelming. Yellow and orange usually feel positive and high energy. They are often linked to optimism, warmth, fun, friendliness, and movement. That is why warm edits around sunlight, skin, firelight, or golden hour often feel alive and inviting. Blue and green often move to the opposite direction. Across studies, they are more often linked to positive but lower arousal emotions like calmness, comfort, relaxation, and balance. In practical design contexts, blue is also regularly associated with trustworthiness and professionalism, while green is linked to growth, health, and nature. Purple and pink are more specialized. Purple tends to feel creative, luxurious, mysterious, or powerful. Pink leans more playful, soft, or compassionate. So both can be strong choices when you want a specialized mood instead of a neutral one. And then you have the neutrals. Black can feel dramatic, elegant, or authoritative. White can feel open, clean, or minimal. Gray can feel controlled, calm, or restrained. That is why black and white or neutral heavy edits often feel more minimal, timeless, or editorial. But context always matters. Color can be perceived differently depending on the culture and the situation. So the goal is not to memorize rigid rules. The goal is to understand tendencies. Understanding what a color does is useful, but the real power in photo editing begins once you start combining colors. Most of the common combinations come from the color wheel. The main harmony types used nowadays in design tools are complementary, split complementary, analogous, triadic, and monochromatic. Each one creates a different kind of tension or harmony. Complementary colors sit opposite each other on the color wheel. Because of that, they create the strongest contrast. They are bold and eye-catching, and photography guidance uses them specifically to make a subject pop against the background. Think blue and orange, purple and yellow, or red and green. This is also why orange and teal became so popular in photo and video editing. You see this color combination in a lot of modern movies. And the reason is simple. Skin tones usually sit somewhere in the orange range. Light skin, dark skin, brown skin, they all tend to live in that same general hue range. The main differences are brightness and saturation. And if you want to create strong color contrast with orange, the complementary color is teal. So by keeping the skin tones warm and pushing the background or shadows slightly towards teal, you create separation between the person and the background. And therefore, the subject stands out more. The image feels more cinematic. And the important thing is, this effect doesn't have to be extreme. Often, it's enough to add a subtle tint to the shadows, the darker areas of the background, or the overall color grade. An untrained eye might not even see the difference at first. But the overall image still feels cleaner, more separated, and more cinematic in general. Analogous colors sit next to each other on the color wheel. They are easier on the eye and feel more unified. They are described as cohesive and visually linked, which is exactly why they work so well for dreamy edits, natural gravel grades, soft lifestyle photos, and any image where you want flow instead of conflict. Think teal, blue, and violet, or yellow, orange, and red. Monochromatic schemes stay inside one hue and only change its shades, tones, and tints. That creates a very cohesive look. Depending on contrast, the result can feel modern or dark and dramatic. That is why monochromatic edits work so well for minimalist portraits, product photography, foggy landscapes, and black and white work where mood comes more from tone than from hue. Triadic palettes use 3 colors that are evenly spaced on the wheel. They are more vibrant, more playful, and more obviously stylized. If balanced well, they feel energetic without falling apart. If you push too hard though, they can become chaotic. So triadic color works best when you want a bold editorial or high energy look instead of something subtle. And if you want contrast without going fully complementary, split complementary is often the sweet spot. It still gives you separation and interest, but with less intensity. That makes it especially useful when a photo needs separation, but without being too aggressive. But there is still one important thing you need to understand. A color combination does not mean that every color should appear equally. Usually, one color should dominate the image. That is what you call your primary color. The other colors are just there to support, to create contrast, or to guide attention. A common rule is something like 70-30 or 80-20, for example. That means around 70 to 80% of the image follows one main color direction, while 20 to 30% is used for contrast. For example, in an orange and teal grade, the skin tones might stay warm and orange, while only the shadows or background are pushed slightly towards teal. So the image doesn't become half orange and half teal. That would usually look fake. Instead, one color carries the image, while the other creates separation. That's how you make color contrast feel intentional instead of random. And that's the real power of color theory. It helps you to stop guessing. You don't just make an image warmer because it looks cool. You understand why warmer colors feel more alive. You understand why cooler shadows feel more cinematic. And you understand why certain colors make a subject stand out. So before you edit your next image, don't just ask, does this image look good? Ask, what should this image feel like? Because once you understand color, you're not just editing pixels anymore. You're controlling the mood of the entire image. Let me introduce you to some of the most important tools to color correct your images. And first of all, in order to do so, I want to get a portrait. Because in a portrait, you can usually see a lot of stuff. So let's go back to Google, so google.com, and let's search for Unsplash. Unsplash, for those of you who don't know, is basically a super big image library where people upload photos and stuff like that. And all of those photos are essentially copyright free. So you can use them for your projects. And let's now just search for portrait, for example. And now we can just go down and essentially get any kind of portrait. So that doesn't matter too much. Let's, for example, just get this portrait because I think we can do a lot of stuff with that. So now we can just click this image, and that's also a way to import something into Photoshop. And now we drag it to the bottom where our Photoshop icon is. And now we can just move it into a separate tab right here. So if we are just going to release it right here, it will create a new tab that has exactly the dimensions of our photo. And now this is our image. Now, how can we color correct an image? And how can we adjust our image in general? And for those, we are going to use this icon right here. So I'm going to press this one. And right here, you can see a lot of different effects to adjust our image. We can start by taking a look at color and vibrance, for example. And right here, you can essentially change stuff like temperature, tint, vibrance, and saturation. And let me explain all of this step by step, because some of those things are really important. First of all, every single image has a certain temperature. You can have a warmer look. If you have a warmer look, then your image tends to go more towards the yellows. And then you can also have a colder image, so a colder look. If you have a colder look, then your image tends to go more towards the blues. So let me show you. If you take a look at this image, it probably looks a little bit warmer to most of us. And the reason for this is that by default, it tends to go more towards the yellows. So if I'm now going to move this more towards the blues, for example, like so. So now I went -8 into the blue direction, and you can see it looks a lot cooler. It's not like the image looks completely off. It just creates a different feeling when looking at it. So this here is a cooler look. And of course you can make it a lot cooler, like so. And again, you will get a pretty different look. But you could also make it a little bit warmer, for example. And maybe you can even make it warmer than it was before by moving the slider to the right, like so. And now you can see it looks really warm. And what you like is, of course, to some extent personal preference. But of course, it also depends on what kind of feeling you want to evoke in the person viewing your image. And different temperatures can, of course, evoke different feelings when looking at it. So let's go back to normal, like so. Now you can also control the tint. When your camera takes a photo, it can happen that an image has a little bit too much green or a little bit too much magenta. And by using tint, you can correct this. So if an image looks off, so looks a little bit too green, for example, then you can just take the slider and move it slightly towards the right. And if an image looks a little bit too magenta, for example, then you can take the slider and move it slightly to the left, for example, like so. And I think under those circumstances, for example, it looks a little bit too green, which makes sense. So I'm going to move this one back because, of course, this image here is pretty much alright already. Now we can also adjust vibrance and saturation. And those two ones are pretty similar. Let me first of all increase saturation. And you can see the colors essentially just get a lot stronger. So by increasing the saturation, the colors get stronger. And by decreasing the saturation, the colors get less intense. Let me also show you what the difference is to vibrance. So if I'm going to go to saturation 50, just remember the look or try to remember the look. And let me now increase the vibrance to the pretty much same amount. And you can see, even though it's probably also a little bit too much at that point, it looks a lot better. So vibrance, when increasing it, tries to increase the strength of the colors that are not that strong on that image yet. So vibrance doesn't really increase the color of those parts of an image that are already pretty strong or pretty colorful, but instead it takes the parts that probably lack a little bit of saturation and adds saturation there. So adds color there essentially. So usually I would always recommend you, if you want to add some color or if you want to strengthen the color of an image, to use vibrance over saturation, because that just looks a little bit better in my opinion. But that's of course always personal taste. So to summarize, saturation makes all colors stronger, whereas vibrance prefers dull colors and makes them a little bit stronger. And by default, you will also have this layer mask. So I could also say that I want to increase the vibrance, for example, like so. And then I can just take this layer, I can press Ctrl I. This will invert a layer mask and therefore essentially make it black. So now this effect here does not affect the layer at all. But now I can paint on this layer mask by using a white brush like so. Now I could, for example, only use those effects on the eyes, for example. So now I could, for example, increase the vibrance of our eyes. And that is something that you will do a lot when you use those effects right here. So when using those effects, you will oftentimes use a layer mask, invert the layer mask, and only apply those effects to a certain area, for example. So now you could, of course, also add more blue or more yellow to those eyes. Under those circumstances, it probably doesn't make too much sense, but you see how this could also look pretty cool in a fantasy image, for example. So I think you get the idea. So let me now just delete this filter and let's take a look at the next important filter. So again, we're going to go to this icon right here. And now the next important one is probably brightness and contrast. You will not use it that often, but from time to time, you want to increase the brightness of your image, for example, and then you can essentially just increase the slider right here and add more brightness to an image or make it darker in general. Again, I think there are better ways to adjust brightness in an image, but this here is a pretty simple way. And this will just make pretty much every pixel a little bit brighter. So the entire image will essentially get brighter. You can also increase the contrast. This essentially means the dark points of an image will get darker and the bright points of an image will get brighter. You will see how this looks once I do it. And you can see everything gets darker, that is already dark, and everything gets brighter, that is already bright. And you can of course also remove a little bit of contrast, and then your image will look a little bit flatter. And of course, what look you're going for always decides whether you're going to increase or decrease the contrast. But again, also for the contrast, I think there are better ways to do it. We again have this layer mask by default, so we could also only add a little bit of brightness to certain areas. So I could, for example, select the layer mask, press Ctrl I to invert it, and now I could only apply this brightness effect to the eyes, for example, and this will make them pop out essentially. So obviously pretty bad, like so. Now we have this effect right here. And now I could, for example, decrease the opacity a little bit, like so. And now they are just a little bit brighter. That's up to you. That's something, for example, that a couple of people do when adjusting portraits. So this is before and this is after. And this just makes the eyes pop a little more. So I think you get the idea. Of course, this wasn't perfect, but yeah. Let's now take a look at the next filter that is important. And that one is a really, really important filter. And that's the curves filter. And using curves, you can do pretty much anything you did using brightness and contrast, but you have much more control. So right here at the bottom, you see a histogram of the actual color distribution. So those things that are further to the right are bright parts of your image, and those parts that are further to the left are dark parts of your image. And you can see a lot of this image is probably around the center. So most parts of this image are essentially neutral when it comes to their brightness. Some parts are a little bit brighter, like the eyes, for example, and some parts are a little bit darker, like the hairs, for example. And now you have this RGB curve right here. And you can move this RGB curve to the top, to the bottom, and so on. And you can add a couple of points by just clicking there, essentially. Let me undo this, like so. And now, by dragging this curve up or down essentially, you can say that certain parts of an image should get brighter or darker and so on. So right here, I'm essentially saying, when moving it a little bit further to the top, that everything should get a little bit brighter because I'm moving essentially everything up a little bit, but especially the midtones should get a lot brighter. Now, I could also take the darker parts right here by adding a new point, and I could say, maybe I want my dark parts to be a little bit darker. So now I added a little bit more darkness to the dark parts, but I could also say for the bright parts, I want my bright parts to be a little bit darker as well, as you can see. So that is possible as well. And of course, this looks completely bad, but I want you to understand the idea. Those parts here are the midtones, that's what you call them. So essentially, the parts of your image that have neutral brightness. Those ones here are the shadows. So essentially the parts of your image that are darker by default, like the hair right here. And those ones are the highlights. So essentially the parts of your image that are brighter. And now I can adjust pretty much all of those parts by using curves separately. So I can make the highlights brighter, for example. I can make the shadows darker, for example, and I can make the midtones brighter. I can make them darker. I can also keep them as they are. And that's what you call an S-curve. So you will see an S-curve pretty often because that one essentially just adds contrast to an image. So this is pretty similar to using brightness and contrast and just moving the contrast up. So you can see this is only using contrast and this is only using curves. And the result is somewhat similar. But you already see the benefits of using a curve. By using brightness and contrast, you can only say, I want to add brightness or I want to add contrast. Contrast just means make the dark parts darker and make the bright parts brighter. But you cannot really decide how much brighter and how much darker you want to make the dark and the bright parts. And using a curve, you can define exactly how much brighter you want to make the bright parts essentially, and you can exactly define how much darker or brighter, of course, you want to make the dark parts. So a curve gives you much more control when you want to adjust the brightness and also the contrast of your image. Because you could, of course, also make the entire image brighter by just moving this curve here to the top. And you could, of course, also make the entire image a little bit darker by just moving this curve here to the bottom. And now you can delete a point by just pressing Ctrl and clicking that point. So that is how you would do that. Something that is cool about curves is that you can also only select the red parts of an image, only select the green parts of an image, and only select the blue parts of an image. So RGB essentially. Because by using RGB, you can essentially generate every other color that exists. So by adjusting RGB, you can essentially adjust every single color in the image. And let me show you how this works. Let's go back to this website. Let's go to Google and let's search for Peloton, for example. It doesn't really matter, but I like Peloton. And this here will give you a color palette. And right here, you see that, for example, green is the opposite of red, blue is the opposite of yellow, essentially, and so on. So I think you understand the principle. And now I could, for example, say, I want to decrease the reds in my image. And you can see my entire image gets greener. Why is that? Because if you take a look at this Peloton, if you remove red, you're going to add green at the same time, because red is the opposite of green. And now the same, of course, works with the other colors. So let me just reset this one by Control clicking that point. And let's do the exact same by using blue. Again, blue is the opposite of yellow, as you can see. So if I'm going to remove blue, I should get a form of yellow. So let me do so. I'm going to remove blue, and you can see our image gets yellow. If I'm going to add blue though, of course, we remove yellow and add more blue. So our image gets bluish. And of course, if you add red, the image gets red. And if you add green, the image gets green. So I think you understand how this works. And now, of course, we can also adjust those colors inside of the midtones, inside of the highlights, and inside of the shadows. So I could, for example, say that I want my highlights to have, for example, a little more blue or a little less blue, so a little more yellow. So I'm going to move this one here to the bottom. And now my highlights will become a little more yellowish. I can say my midtones should just be there. And maybe my shadows should have a little more blue. So I'm going to move this curve here to the top for the blue parts, essentially. And now you can see that the hair, for example, is a little more bluish, whereas my highlight is a little more yellowish, essentially. So if you take a look at the highlights, right here, for example, you can see once I move this to the top, it gets a little more blue, or it gets a little more bluish. And if I move it to the bottom, you can see this highlight here gets pretty yellow. And of course, the exact opposite when we use the shadows. So I'm going to take a look at the shadows. Let me move this here to the top. You can see our hair gets a lot bluer, whereas I can also do the opposite. And now our hair gets a lot more yellowish. So this is how all of this works. You can use those curves to exactly, and this here looks terrible, so let me just remove this like so. So you can use those curves to exactly define how a certain part of your image should look like. So how the highlight should look like, how the midtone should look like, and how the shadows should look like. So curves gives you full control over brightness and contrast in general, and it gives you full control over the colors inside of your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So curves pretty much allows you to control your entire image. And curves is one of the most powerful, but also most complex tools inside of Photoshop at all. If you're good with curves, there's really not much you need besides curves. And of course, you also have this layer mask that allows you to apply curves only to a certain point of your image. But I think you've seen it up to this point plenty of times, so I'm not going to do it again. So let me delete curves and let's take a look at the next tool that might be important. And that one is the exposure tool. And exposure will also just make your image brighter. So I can just put this slider up and you can see our entire image gets brighter or darker. So what is the difference between exposure and brightness? So when you use brightness and contrast right here, brightness just makes every single pixel, so the entire image, brighter. Exposure, on the other hand, changes the image so that it looks as if it has been captured in a brighter scenery. But in general, exposure will make the image feel as if it has been brighter when the image has been captured, or darker when the image has been captured, instead of just making every single pixel brighter or darker. So when you adjust an image, you should mostly start by using exposure first, and then you only make small adjustments by using brightness. So let's delete our exposure layer and let's go on to the next important one, which is hue saturation right here. So again, we can use saturation to make our entire image more saturated. So the intensity of every single pixel will again increase like so, or decrease in case you reduce saturation like so. If you have saturation set to -100, you essentially don't have any color anymore. And let's go back to normal. Right here, you could also adjust lightness by moving the slider to the right or to the left, like so. But the most important one, or the most important slider when you work with hue and saturation, is the hue slider. Because adjusting saturation and lightness is stuff that you would preferably do with other tools. But changing the hue only works by using this hue saturation adjustment layer. And let me just move this to the right so you really see what it does. And you can see it essentially just changes the color. It shifts the color of everything within this image to a different color. So right here, for example, this is the normal starting point. And now if I move it to the right, you can see everything gets a little bit more greenish. Then it gets more greenish. And then at some point, it probably gets bluish and so on. So I can use hue to change the color of certain areas. And like this, it's probably pretty useful. But by using this tool right here, so this hand tool right here, you can only select a certain area. So now I could, for example, say I want to select the eyes right here. So let me select the eyes. And now we've done a selection. And you can see the colors that we've selected right here. And now we can use, or we can change the slider right here. And you can see we're essentially mainly adjusting our eyes, but we're also adjusting a couple of different regions. And we are essentially adjusting all of the regions that fall into this color range right here. So now we could also make this narrower, for example, like so, or we could also do it wider, like so. And you have those inner sliders right here, and you also have those outer sliders. And those inner sliders, so everything within this range, will be fully affected, whereas everything without this outer range right here will be a smooth transition. So it will only be partly affected. And now let's use again this color picker right here. And now we have the selection, and let me try to adjust it so we're mainly selecting our eyes, which could be impossible for this image because under those circumstances, the eyes have a pretty similar color, so a pretty similar hue essentially to the skin. So let's, for example, move this here to the right and this here to the left. So we have a really, really small selected area. Then I'm also going to move this one to the left like so, and this one to the right like so, until we have mainly selected our eyes like so. And now maybe we need to select a little bit more. So I'm going to move this here a little bit to the left like so. And you can see this is what this looks like. But at a certain point, it's not really possible to only get the eyes. So under those circumstances, I would recommend you to do it somewhat like this. So the eyes look clean. And then I would just invert the layer mask and use the layer mask to get a better selection. And to be precise, most of the times I would use the layer mask and selecting only one single area by using this picker right here is something that can work from time to time, but oftentimes it will not. But I want you to be aware of this because it is something that you might want to do from time to time. And by doing so by using hue, we've now changed the color of the eyes, for example. And now we can give it pretty much any eye color we like. So we can go to green, for example. So now she has green eyes. We can go over to, probably almost the original eye color. We can have red eyes and so on. So we can also change the saturation now by using the saturation slider. And we can add saturation, and this of course looks terrible. Or we can remove saturation like this. We can also adjust the lightness right here. So we could make them a little bit brighter, a little more saturated. And now I think this looks kind of cool already. So now we could also have maybe green eyes. And I think those eyes look pretty nice, for example. So again, would be kind of cool for a fantasy image, for example. And now I also want to introduce you to a concept that we didn't really talk about up to this point. So every single color is essentially made up of three components. The first component is the hue. And the hue essentially decides the color. So the hue could be pink, for example. The hue could be yellow. The hue could be blue. So the hue decides the color of a color, essentially. Hope that makes sense. So now we have a hue of 195, for example. And you can see if we move the slider from bottom to top, we change our hue from 0 to a maximum of essentially 359. So you can see we're going from 0 to 360 right here. And now we can, for example, have a hue of 144. Now, the second metric that is important is the saturation. The saturation decides how strong the color is. So you can have a saturation of 100, for example. So it's essentially pure green. But you can also have a saturation of only 50. And you can see now it moved to the middle. So this here is 50% saturated green. And you can also say we want to have 0. So this now is 0% saturated green. And if you have a saturation of 0, you essentially have gray. So you can change the hue by moving this slider here, because that is the color. You can change the saturation by going from left to right, because that changes how saturated a color is. And the third component that decides how a color looks is the brightness. So a color can be brighter or it can be darker. And by changing the brightness, you essentially change the last component. So let's have a saturation of 50, for example. And you will see how the brightness affects the color if we go to a brightness of 0, for example, because now we have a hue of blue, we have a saturation of 50%, but our color will appear black because we don't have any brightness. Now, once we add brightness of 50, for example, you can see it looks like dark blue. The hue and the saturation are still the same, but our brightness went up a little bit. It's still pretty dark, but it got a lot brighter compared to before. Now we can go to 100. So 100, and you can see now our color looks completely different, even though we still have the same hue, so it's still blue. We still have the same saturation, so it's still 50% saturated, but our brightness went up to 100. So by changing hue, saturation, and brightness, we can change how a color looks. And it's really important to understand those components, because by using the hue saturation layer, we're especially focusing on changing the hue, so the color. Of course, we're also able to change the saturation here, but again, if you want to focus on the saturation, you will mostly use other adjustment layers. So the hue saturation adjustment layer is mainly there to adjust the hue of a certain color. So essentially, what color is it? And now, by doing so, you can see we can do that. So now let's delete those two layers right here, and let's go on to the next adjustment layer, which is color balance right here. And we already understood shadows, midtones, and highlights. So shadows, the dark parts of an image, midtones, the medium parts of an image essentially, and highlights, the bright parts of an image. And by using color balance, we can adjust the color within every single part of an image. So now we could, for example, target our highlights, and we could say our highlights, so maybe those eyes right here, the white parts of our eyes, should maybe have a little more red inside of them. And now you can see it targets a lot of highlights, so it seems like a lot of stuff is bright within our image. And you can see we add a little bit of red. Now let's also target the shadows, and let's say our shadows should have a little bit more cyan, for example. And you can see this targets our hair, because our hair is pretty dark at the moment. And of course, I'm doing it a little bit too much, but I really want you to understand how this works. And now the midtones, let me add a little bit more green there. And you can see the midtones essentially represent those parts that are in the middle of our image. So probably the skin tones and a lot of stuff, to be precise. And from time to time, you might want to use a color balance. I don't use it that often, but in case you want to adjust the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights separately, this is a pretty good way to do it. I personally prefer other ways, but that would be a good way as well. So let's delete this layer right here, like so, and let's create a new adjustment layer. And let's now take a look at black and white. And there's not really much to say about it. In case you want to create a black and white image, you can do so by using black and white. And you can, for example, say whether the reds inside of your image should tend more towards the bright side or more towards the dark side. And of course, you can do the exact same for yellow, green, cyan, and so on. So I think you understand how this works. You likely won't use this too often though. Let me delete this, and let's go on to the next layer. The photo filter essentially just adds a different color to an image, and you can adjust the strength. You will probably not use this too often as well, but right here you can select a couple of different colors. So I could use a red color and so on. You can also adjust the color right here by clicking on it. And for example, add this color to your image. So that is up to you. Again, you will probably not use this too much, but in case you want, you can do it there. Now, there also exists the color lookup, like so. That one might be important to a couple of you because it allows you to add a LUT. But in my opinion, LUTs are much more common in video editing, and LUTs are essentially just presets. So in case you use, for example, curves, then you use exposure, then you use hue saturation, and then you add a little bit of saturation, a little bit of exposure, then you have some curves. Obviously this looks terrible, but I think you get the idea. You now could take all of those adjustments and turn them into a LUT. And then you could export or save this LUT somewhere. And later on, you could use this color lookup right here to load this LUT. So you could, for example, load those LUTs from your device, or you can just use a couple of predefined LUTs that Photoshop provides by pressing on it. For example, crisp warm look will add a LUT that creates a crisp warm look, as the name implies. We can also use 2-strip, 3-strip, and so on. So I think you get the idea. LUTs are essentially just presets that someone else did, in this case the Photoshop team, that we can apply to our image that already have a lot of effects. In my opinion, when you want to have full control over an image, in Photoshop they are not that common, but maybe from time to time you want to use them. So you can find them right here under color lookup. Let me delete this, like so. And let's go on to the next one, which is selective color. And that one might be important for a couple of you because it allows you to define the color for every single color. What do I mean by this? Right here, I can select all of the different tones of our image. So the reds of our image, the yellows of our image, the greens of our image. Here I can also select the whites, the neutrals, and the blacks, for example. So now I could, for example, say my blacks should have a lot of red color inside of them. So now you can see our blacks, so our hairs, have a lot of red. And of course, usually you would only make this pretty subtle, like so. But to really show you how this works, we can also make this really strong. And now you see the difference, I think. I can target my blacks. Of course, I can also target my whites. Maybe my whites should be a little bit more yellowish, like so. And I can do so by adjusting this slider right here, for example. And you can see we have a completely different feeling by doing so. Of course, we can also adjust the neutrals, so everything in between. And this will affect a lot of parts of our image, because most of the times when you have an image, you mainly have neutrals, then you have a couple of shadows and a couple of highlights. But most images mainly consist of neutrals. So this will, of course, have a pretty strong effect. And then you can also adjust the individual color channels. So this image, if you take a look at the skin is usually somewhere between red and yellow. So usually skin tone for every single person is between red and yellow. So it's some form of orange. So if I'm going to select my reds, for example, and I'm going to add a little bit more yellow, for example, you can see that this, for example, targets our skin. Because again, skin is somewhere between yellow and red, so somewhat orange. And skin has some red parts, so some parts that tend more towards the red. Those are usually the shadows. And some parts that tend to be or tend to go more towards yellow, those are usually the brighter parts. So my shadows should get a little bit more yellowish once I go to the right, as you can see. And now I'm going to target my yellow parts. And I could, for example, say that my yellow parts, so probably more of the highlights, should go more towards red, for example. And now you should see a difference, like so. And I think you get the idea. By using selective color, you can select a certain color and then change the colors of those colors essentially. So I could say that your yellows should be more reddish, should be more greenish, and so on. Again, that is a tool that can be really, really powerful when you edit portraits, for example. So that is something that a lot of people use. Let me delete this one right here. And let's go on to the next filter, which is probably the gradient map, because that one is pretty important from time to time. A gradient map essentially just takes the image below and turns all of the dark parts to whatever color you have to the left and all of the bright parts to whatever color you have to the right. In case I want to create a black and white image, I just say that my dark parts have the color black and my bright parts have the color white. I could also say that my dark parts should have a dark version of blue, for example, like so. And my bright parts should have a bright version of blue, like so, for example. Or maybe a bright version of yellow. So I think you get the idea. A gradient map is essentially just a map that turns anything that is below this gradient map into one of the defined colors. So everything that is completely dark will be transformed into whatever we define to the left, and everything that is completely white will be transformed to whatever we have to the right. And everything in between will be transformed to whatever is defined in between. We can of course also add colors by just clicking there. And now I could say this here should be something like this, for example. And this here should be something like this, for example. So that is up to you. So I think you understand that you can create a lot of cool effects by using this gradient map, for example. So let's press OK, and let me for now just delete this gradient map. So now let's take a look at solid color next. And solid color essentially just does what the name implies. You can create a solid color. So you can just choose any color you like, press OK, and this will create a solid color like so. So that is pretty simple. You can always change the color by pressing or double clicking on this layer. Now we could select green and press OK again. So that is a pretty simple way to create a solid background. Let me delete this one. And now let's finally take a look at gradient, because that one allows you to create a basic gradient. So you can also open this drop down and you can select from a couple of predefined gradients right here, press OK. And of course, you can also define your own gradient right here. So I could double click this color right here. For example, choose a different color, so maybe green, and double click this color and also choose a different color, so maybe blue. And now we have a gradient from green to blue. And of course, we can also change the type right here, as we've done previously. So it could be radial, angle, and so on. So I think you understand how this works. You can also change the angle right here in case you want to. So all of this is up to you again. So now let's understand the difference between a smart object and a rasterized object. So let me create a rectangle, for example, like so. And let me duplicate this rectangle. You can duplicate a layer by pressing Ctrl J. So this will create a copy. Now I'm going to move this copy to the right, like so. And I'm going to deselect those layers. Now I can turn something into a smart object by right-clicking it and converting it to smart object. I can rasterize something by selecting it, right-clicking the layer, and then pressing rasterize layer. And now let me make this layer super small. So really small, like so, for example. And now let me select it. Let me make it a lot bigger again, like so. And you can see it still looks pretty much the exact same. So it looks the exact same, to be precise. Now I'm going to select this one, the rasterized layer. I'm going to make this super small. And I'm going to take it. And now I'm going to upscale it. So I'm going to make it super big once again. And I think you can already see the difference. So like this. And you can see now this here looks super weird. So once you rasterize a layer, it's not really possible to transform it without losing quality. So when you scale it up, scale it down, and so on, you will always lose quality once you have a rasterized layer. The difference is you can use the eraser, for example, on the rasterized layer, and you can also draw onto the rasterized layer. So all of this stuff here works. When I click on the smart object, for example, I'm not really able, as you can see, to erase, for example. In order to do so, Photoshop suggests me that I should rasterize the smart object, which I'm not going to do. I can, of course, also not draw onto the smart object like so. But on the other hand, this object here will be editable and I will not lose any quality when I edit this object. So a smart object will preserve the quality even when you're editing it, whereas a rasterized layer will not preserve the quality when editing it. And something that is also beneficial about a smart object is that you can, for example, let me duplicate this a couple of times by pressing Ctrl J. And now you can also have a lot of different layers. And something that is nice about a smart object is that you can also select a couple of layers at once, then right-clicking all of those layers, and now you can convert them to a smart object, and this will convert it to a single layer essentially. And later on, you can always double-click the smart object, and you will get back to the original view. And now you could edit it right here. So I could do something like this, for example. I could now press Ctrl S to save it. I can close this, And you can see now our smart object has all of those changes right here. So I also use smart objects pretty often to group related content and still keep it editable. Because once you rasterize something, you can never edit it again, whereas the smart object will always stay editable. So I usually recommend you to always use smart objects. And in case you, for example, need to erase something, you can of course just use the layer mask, which is, in my opinion, the recommended way anyways. So like so, I can just use a layer mask and still erase on my smart object. And in case I want to create or draw onto the smart object, I could always just use another layer. So I don't really see why you would use rasterized layers in general. If you have the possibility, I recommend you to always use smart objects. So let me delete this, and let me also delete this because we will not need this anymore. Let me now introduce you to one of the most important concepts in Photoshop when you edit photos, and probably the only tab that you would actually need if you are editing portraits and you don't want to spend hours on editing an image, because this tab will give you really professional results within a couple of minutes. Let's go over to our portrait right here that we had previously, and now we can go to filters, and right here you can select camera raw filter. That filter will open those settings that allow you to adjust pretty much all parameters at once and essentially adjust an image the way you like. So right here, let's go from top to bottom. You could, for example, adjust the exposure of an image by dragging the slider to the right or to the left. And right here, you also see the color distribution and the brightness, shadow, midtone distribution of your image. If you hover over a certain area, you also see which part falls into the midtones, highlights, whites, right here, shadows, and blacks. And now you can actually adjust all of those things right here. So if you take a look at those things right here, and I'm going to move the exposure tab, you can see that everything just moves to the right, and especially the highlights go to the right. Now, if I adjust the contrast, you can see that the darks get darker and the bright things get brighter, like so. If I adjust the highlights, you can see those are the highlights. I can move them to the right, and you can see that my highlights get brighter, essentially, like so. I can also make the shadows a little bit darker, and I can also adjust the whites and the blacks, essentially. And usually, when you work with those sliders right here, you can do a lot already. And this here is actually just personal preference. So usually I'm just playing around with them until I have the look that I'm looking for. So there's no right or wrong. You just open an image by using the camera raw filter, and then you just test what looks good. Then right below, you can also adjust the color. And that is pretty similar to what we've already seen. Right here, you can adjust the temperature like so. So you can make it a little bit more bluish or a little bit more yellowish, for example, like so. Then you can also adjust the tint like this. Again, you have vibrance and saturation right here. I usually prefer vibrance, but of course that's up to you as well, like this. And then you can even add a couple of effects right here. So you could add a little more texture, and this will just increase the texture right here. And I think you will see it very good. If I'm going to zoom in, let me take out a little bit of texture. And you can see we're losing a little bit of texture, but the skin gets super smooth. And I can also add a little bit of texture, and everything gets super sharp. And depending on what look you're looking for, you can adjust the texture right here. You can also adjust the clarity like so, or remove clarity. And you can also do dehaze like this, a vignette, so a black background, for example, something like this, or a white background or white vignette to be precise, like this. And of course, you can also adjust the grain, for example, like this. So this will just give you this grainy look that you're seeing right here, and this will remove the grainy look. So whatever you like. And then right here, you also have things like curve, for example, and we've already seen how curves work. So I can just make the exact same right here. So I can add points. So I can move something to the top, something to the bottom, something to the bottom, and so on. So I think you understand how this works. And then you also have the color mixer right here. And right here, you can select or adjust hue, saturation, and luminance, which essentially is the brightness of a color. So you could, for example, say, for every red color, I want the red color to go more towards the orange, for example, like so. And I want all of the yellows to go more towards the orange, for example, like so. And now you can see that is the look that we're getting. You could also target all of the greens, for example, or all of the purples, all of the magentas, and so on. And you can always shift one color to the color that is essentially one level higher or one level further down. So essentially to the next color. So I could change red to either magenta or orange. You can change orange to either red or yellow. You can change yellow to either orange or green, and green to either yellow or aqua. So by using this color mixer, you can adjust the hue of a certain color, but you can also adjust the saturation of a certain hue. So maybe I want all of my reds to have a little bit more saturation, like so. And you can see, especially if you take a look at the background, that the saturation of our background increases once I move the slider to the right. Of course, I can do the exact same for our oranges. And you can see, especially our skin tones have a lot of orange. So when I move this slider, it especially affects our skin tones. Of course, I can do the same for yellow, green, and all of the other colors. And the same, of course, also works for luminance. So I can select a certain color and say that I want to make it a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. And of course, this works for all of the colors once again. So right here, I have a lot of control over everything. So there's the color mixer. And right below, you also have color grading. Right here, you have pretty good control over your midtones, your highlights, and your shadows. And you already know what your midtones, shadows, and highlights are. So you can just move this color right here and essentially say, make my highlights, for example, or make my midtones a little bit more bluish, for example, like so. Make them more yellowish, like so. And I think you get the idea. But I barely use this. But in case you want, you can use those color wheels to adjust your color grading overall. And by double clicking it, you can always remove it. So reset it to the default settings. So let's close this. And right here, you can change a lot more. So you can just test this out. This is literally stuff that I barely use at all. You can sharpen your image, can use noise reduction, and so on. But again, I barely use it. You can just test it, and I'm pretty sure you'll understand how this works in a couple of seconds anyways. But the most important settings are literally light, color, and effects. And by using this camera raw filter, you can really get a great look by literally only spending a couple of minutes. And once you're done, you can press OK and you're good to go. But now again, you will see the difference between a rasterized layer and a smart object. So now you can see I applied this filter, but there's no way to change something about those filters. So let's imagine, for example, that I added something to this camera raw filter. So maybe crazy yellow and a little bit of vibrance. And I actually like this look, but now there's no way to only adjust this look a little bit. All I can do is press Ctrl Z and I can go or completely remove this filter. But there's no way to, for example, slightly adjust this filter and do some subtle changes. So in order to do so, you could right click this layer, convert it to a smart object. Now I could press filter, camera raw filter. I can add temperature. Maybe my shadows should be a little bit darker. My highlights should be a little bit brighter. I can press OK. And now you can see I have this camera raw filter right here. And maybe I think this image is kind of right, but I want to do some subtle changes. So now I can just double click camera raw filter. I can go here, maybe make the temperature a little bit less yellowish. And now I'm probably saying, yeah, this looks kind of right to me. Maybe a little more exposure. Now I can press OK. And I applied those changes. And every time I want to change something, I can now just double click the camera raw filter right there, and I will always be able to get back to the settings and adjust the settings over and over again. So that is why you also want to mainly use smart objects when working in Photoshop. Now that we have an image that looks kinda right, let me show you how to export this image. So I can, for example, send it to a friend or upload it to YouTube or whatever you want. In order to export an image, so save an image, you can use File, Export, and Export As. And now you can define the file type, PNG, JPG, GIF. And when you decide between PNG and JPG, there are mainly two things. If you take a look at the size, you can see the size of an image right here. A PNG, or this PNG, has a size of 15 megabytes. If I'm now going to switch to JPG, you can see it only has 3 megabytes. So a JPG image is a lot smaller. So every time you need a pretty small file size, you want to have a JPG. A PNG has a much bigger file size and a little bit more quality if you open it, but I'm going to be honest, your normal eye will barely see the difference between PNG and JPG, or to be precise, a normal eye wouldn't see a difference between PNG and JPG. So if you prioritize smaller sizes, you should always use JPG. If the size doesn't matter for you, then you can use PNG and the quality will be slightly better. And now you can just press Export. This here is kind of right, doesn't matter. You can press OK. Now you can select a location, so maybe my desktop, and I'm going to say cool image. I'm going to press enter, and this will save this image on my desktop. Now I can go to my desktop, and right here I have my cool image saved as a PNG. Now something that is pretty useful about PNG is the following. So let me just create a new file. Doesn't matter actually, like so. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to delete the background layer, and maybe I want to have a transparent point, like so. And now I want to export this one. So I can go to File, Export, Export As, and let me now export this one as a PNG, so point, like so, and also as a JPG. So I'm going to use JPG. And in case you wonder how I exported it without pressing File Export, if you press Ctrl, Alt, Shift, and W at the same time, you can also export it by just using the keyboard shortcut. And now I can export it as a JPG, desktop. Let me say this is point JPG, like so. Let me go to this girl. And now let's select our point that is a PNG. And I'm going to drag it onto this layer right here, and you can see it's fully transparent, like so. So PNG seems to preserve transparency. So even if you import it into a different file, it is still transparent, and only the exported area, so only this circle right here, will be visible. If I'm now, on the other hand, going to import our JPG, you can see that JPG did never preserve transparency. So now we also have a white background. So every time you want to preserve transparency for an image, you have to export it as a PNG file. A JPG will not preserve transparency. And that is a difference that is really important to understand. It's your favorite NPC, and today I will help you with your colors using Photoshop. You will learn how you can target something on an image and change its color specifically without modifying the rest. So let's get started, guys. Let me show you the fastest way to change the color of something in Photoshop. Imagine we are having this image right here, and we only want to change this purple clothing right here to maybe red, maybe yellow, so that is up to you. And in order to do so, we are going to use a new adjustment layer, and that one has the name Hue Saturation right here. And now we can take the hand tool and only select the color that we want to adjust later on. So I'm going to select pink right here. And you can see right here, we are having our selected colors. So currently our selected colors are in the blue-purple range, I would say. If I'm now going to change the hue, you can see that it somehow selected our color, like so. But it is probably not a perfect selection, as you can see, because it doesn't really select our highlights as well. So now I can also click this plus symbol that allows us to select the color range. I'm going to reset this to 0 again. And now let's take a look at this part right here. Once I click the shadows, like so, you see that this here moves. So adding more and more colors adjusts the range to which we apply the effect later on. Maybe also this one. Let's just try to get pretty much everything. Like so. And now I'm going to move the hue right here. And you can see we pretty much have a perfect selection of our clothing. So now I can get a green clothing. I can also get blue. I could get yellow. How could I get yellow? I have to go to the yellow hue. But by default, when having yellow, something like this, you also need to increase the saturation to make it really look or appear yellow. And sometimes also the lightness as well, something like this. So if you really want it to look yellowish, you also have to adjust saturation and lightness pretty often. For most of the other colors, it also works without touching saturation and lightness, as you can see right here. So blue looks perfectly fine without ever touching it, or green, and so on. From time to time, this selection tool here can also fail. So let me delete this entire thing right here. And if you have an image where this selection does not work, so where selecting the color does not work properly, then I would always recommend you to create a layer mask. So to somehow create a selection like this, and like this. And now we can just create a layer mask by using a brush. Let's select the layer mask. Let's have a black color. And let's just make everything black right here on the layer mask. You cannot see anything because we're drawing on the layer mask, but now you see that our entire selection should now be black on the layer mask. So our effect, the hue saturation effect, will only apply to everything but the layer mask currently. So we need to invert it by pressing Ctrl I. This will invert the layer mask and now only affect our hoodie essentially. And now we have the exact same effect, as you can see right here. And it's as simple as that to change the color of something inside of Photoshop. Now let's take a closer look at text. So we can now close this portrait, and we can also close this right here and this right here. And let's go back to this right here, for example. Let's delete this and let's just create a new text by selecting the text icon right here. Alternatively, you can also just press T and this will allow you to write a new text. So let's say hello for now. And now I'm going to change this type right here. So I'm going to remove the style. So I have a normal text. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger like so. And now I'm going to press Ctrl T and I'm going to move it to the center. If you move text, for example, or pretty much anything in Photoshop, you will see those lines indicating that you're in the center, for example. So this here is the center of our image. Of course, you can also resize text by using those marks right here, like this. So that is up to you. So now we have this text. And now we can further adjust the text by double-clicking the layer right here to the right. And you shouldn't double-click the text because that will just rename it. So I really have to double-click it right here. And this will open this layer styles window. And right here you have a lot of layer styles. And you will probably use a couple of them from time to time, but a lot of them are also pretty useless. So let's start from top to bottom. So right here, you can essentially add bevel and emboss, and you can, for example, add a little bit more size like so. You can add a little bit more depth like so. You can soften it like this, and I think you get the idea. This allows you to, for example, add a little bit more three-dimensionality to text, for example. And you can do pretty cool stuff with that. You see people use bevel and emboss in a lot of text tutorials. Therefore, I want you to understand the basics. So then you can also add a stroke to text by using stroke. And you can also adjust the color of the stroke by changing the color right here. And you can also change the size. So this is actually pretty simple. You can also change the position. So I could say Should the stroke be outside of the text? Should it be to the center of the text? Or should it be inside of the text? And depending on what you choose, you get a different look. You can add an inner shadow. So now you have a shadow inside of your text. It's currently invisible because it is black on black. So I can use white on black. And I think you get the idea. This will just create a basic shadow. You can adjust the opacity of this shadow right here. You can also adjust the softness by changing the size. So the higher the size, the softer it is going to be essentially. And of course, you can also change the distance like so. So this will adjust how far away the shadow is essentially. And you can also use inner glow. Actually, this is pretty similar. You can also use a color right here and a size like this. You could also use chalk, and you can just play around with those settings. I probably didn't use it that much, but in case you want, you can do. From time to time, you probably want to use a color overlay that allows you to essentially just use a different color for everything, like so. So now we have a red color for the text. You can also use a gradient overlay for the text. So you can change the color of this gradient by just clicking it right here. And now you can select the starting color, so maybe red, and an ending color. And I think black is actually kind of nice, so I'm going to stick to that one. You can also change the angle right here. So it could go from left to right, from right to left, from top to bottom, or from bottom to top. You can also, of course, change the opacity. And all of this is up to you. And I think you understand how this works. You pretty much always have this opacity slider. Then you can change the color of something, like a shadow, a stroke, and so on. And then you just change the scaling somewhere. You can also add a pattern overlay, but in my opinion, this is pretty useless. You can test it and you'll understand how this works. So you can just select out of a couple of patterns right here. And then you can also use an outer glow if you wanted to. And again, just test it out. It's not that complicated, but you probably use drop shadow most of the times anyways. And drop shadow is something that is important because that is something that you will probably use pretty often. But it's pretty similar to the rest as well. So I can change the opacity right here. The color, of course, once again, oftentimes you will use black. And then you can change the distance like so. And by adjusting the size, you can adjust the softness of the shadow like so. So now you have a soft shadow. Now you have a pretty hard shadow, for example. And right here, you can see this here is a pretty nice effect, for example, like this. So a lot of people will use this shadow to create some shadow around a text like this. And now something that is important though, is that you can also use those effects for normal layers. So I could, for example, also create a rectangle like this. Now you could double click this rectangle and you'll get the exact same layer styles window. So now you could also add a drop shadow right here. And you can see we added this drop shadow. We can also make this a little bit softer, for example. And now we are getting this effect. And you can see it looks slightly three-dimensional. And that is a pretty cool effect as well. So I think you understand how this works. It's your favorite NPC, and today I will show you how to create thumbnails using Photoshop the modern way. Thumbnail design today is completely different from what it used to be like 1 or 2 years ago. I will show you step by step how to get professional looking thumbnails and all the modern tools available to get the best result possible. So let's get started, guys. Let me introduce you to the modern way of creating thumbnails in Photoshop in 2025 and 2026. So let's get started by first of all creating a new file. And usually when I make a thumbnail, it's important that the aspect ratio is 69 and the width to height ratio that fulfills this aspect ratio of 69 is 1920 times 1080 pixels, for example. So we're going to use a width of 1920 pixels and a height of 1080 pixels. We're going to press create, and this will create our thumbnail. At the moment, we only have this white background. So now let's imagine we wanted to have a thumbnail similar to Mr. Beast, where we are standing in front of an ice cage. In order to do so, we should first get some reference material. So I'm going to go over, open a new tab, and right here I'm going to search for Unsplash, because that page provides copyright-free photos that we can use. And now I'm going to search for a cave entrance, for example, like so. And now we can just search for the right photo for our image. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be somewhat alright. And I think maybe this one here is kind of right. So I'm going to open it. Let me just copy this image and I'm going to paste it into ChatGPT. Now you might wonder, why am I posting this into ChatGPT? And the reason for this is, this photo is kind of alright, but it's not really winter. There's no eyes on this photo, and I think the cave could also be a little bit better. And in those days where you have AI, like ChatGPT for example, you could just prompt it to turn this into a nice scenery. So I can say, turn this cave into a nice scenery. The cave entrance should be centered, for example. Everything should be winter and ice or snow, and it should have an aspect ratio of 16:9, for example. And 16:9 essentially just means on 16 pixels of width, there come 9 pixels of height. Now you can see I'm using the mode thinking when using ChatGPT, because as far as I know, this improves the quality when generating images. And now it will take a short time and try to generate that image. Of course, it's possible that the first image doesn't look too good, and then you can try it over and over again. And you can see this is the image that we're getting at this point. It's kind of right, it's not perfect at this point, but that is all we need for now. Because now I can take a couple of images of me. I will show them to you in a second. The more you have, the better. And actually the more perspectives, the better as well, probably. So right here, I just have a couple of images of myself. So this one, this one, this one. You can see they're far from perfect and they don't need to be perfect. They just need to show what you actually look like, or somewhat what you look like. And now I'm going to say, this is me. I want to be standing in front of the cage. It is for a YouTube thumbnail, so colors should be catching. I want to have a torch in my right hand and some big or some winter clothing that fits a nice scenery. I want to be in the center of the image with the cage entrance right behind me, for example. So that's how I would prompt that. And now I can again just press enter, for example. And again, it's likely that the initial image will probably not be perfect. And this here just takes a little bit of time to generate the correct image. And I know we didn't touch Photoshop at this point in time, but we'll get there soon, don't worry. And you can see this here's the image that we're getting. And actually, to be precise, I would argue that it's not really that necessary anymore to use Photoshop right here, because I think it looks pretty cool already. But now let me show you how you can use Photoshop to add a little bit of stuff if you wanted to. So now we can just go ahead, copy this image right here. I'm going to paste it into Photoshop like so. And now imagine we wanted to have a little bit more of our body right here, and a little bit more space to the left and to the right, and maybe also to the top. Now I can just use the selection tool. I'm going to select pretty much anything around our current layer, like so. And now I'm going to press Generative Fill. I don't have to describe it right here, because I think Photoshop will detect it pretty good on its own. And now I'm going to press Generate. And this will just give me a little more space to the left and to the right. And now you can see it added a little bit of scenery around me. Now I'm going to select both of those layers. I'm going to convert them to a smart object. And now we are having this effect. Now I'm going to make this here a little bit bigger again, just slightly. And now if you think about a real ice scenery, usually it also happens that the ice essentially get frozen and the skin maybe freezes a little bit. And now I'm just going to take my eyelashes. I take a couple of those spots right here. And I'm going to say frozen eyebrows like so. I wait for this to finish. And you can see we only have the subtle effect right here, but I think it's kind of right. So I'm going to convert this to a smart object again. And now I'm also going to do the exact same for the other eyebrow. And I will say frozen eyebrow, like so. And you can see this here looks a little more frozen as well. So just a slight difference, but I think you get the idea. And maybe right now I want to have a skeleton right here and maybe right here lying somewhere in the corner. I'm going to mark this area right here, and now I'm going to say frozen skull, for example. And now I can see we have a skull right here already, and I think this one looks really, really cool. And maybe I'm also going to add another skull to the right. So I'm going to convert this to a smart object, and right here, actually maybe I'm going to mark all of this like so, and I'm going to say frozen skeleton lying on the ground and wall. I'm going to wait for this to finish again. And this here looks terrible. And this here as well, and this as well. So maybe I'm just going to use a frozen skeleton skull, like so. And now we have a skull right here as well. And this is what it looks like. And I think this one is pretty cool, so I'll keep that one. Now, maybe I also want to have this torch glowing a little bit more. Or maybe I want to have a couple more fire particles right here. So I'm going to convert this to a smart object. I'm going to go over to Unsplash. And now I'm going to search for fire particles. And I'm just going to use those particles right here. I'm going to copy them. I'll paste them in. I'm going to use, for the blend mode screen, as you can see, I'm going to move this right above our torch, like so. I'm going to use an inverted layer mask by alt-clicking the layer mask symbol, like so. So now nothing is visible, but now I'm going to take a brush. I'm going to use the white color, and now I'm going to go over the areas where I want to have some particles, like so, for example. And now we have a slightly different effect. This is before, this is after. So maybe you cannot see a big difference, but it makes a small difference, I would argue. Now I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to add some orange right here. I'm going to use a very dark version. I'm going to go over our torch right here with that color, like so. So currently it looks terrible, but now I can switch the blending mode to color dodge, linear dodge, so that is up to you, to get this glow effect essentially, like so. So this is before, this is after. And now I'm going to erase it once again, and I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller and go over it once again, like so. And I think this looks a little bit cooler in my opinion. Of course, you can also switch the opacity a little bit, so make this slightly more transparent, and then we're getting this effect. Now I also want to add a text to the top right that says 100 hours, for example. So that would be pretty similar to a thumbnail Mr. Beast would do. So we can do that. So 100 hours, like so. For the text color, I'm going to choose white, like so. For the font, I'm going to use Comica Access Regular. It somehow doesn't seem to work. Now it seems to work, okay. It somehow didn't select the font. So now I have this font right here. I can put 100 hours into the right corner. And maybe I'm going to say 24 hours. Obviously, it depends on the video you are doing. But now, since I can do anything I like, I'll use 24 hours right here. That is something that Mr. Beast also does from time to time. And now I also want to have a shadow to 24 hours. So I'm going to double click it. I'm going to use drop shadow right here. And now we can just experiment with opacity, distance, and size. I'm going to use this kind of distance, for example. And for the size, I'm going to use a size of maybe 10 to make it spread out a little bit, or maybe 13. Opacity, I'll decrease that to 75. And I think this look is kind of alright for me. Something that I always do in the end is I transform everything to a smart object. So I convert everything to a smart object, like so. And now I'm going to add a final camera raw filter to the entire image. So I'm selecting the layer, filter, camera raw filter, like so. And then I usually like to add a little bit more vibrance to the entire image if there's not enough. And oftentimes an image can take a little more vibrance, even though this one is pretty nice already in my opinion. Then for the temperature, I oftentimes go a little bit towards the blues, but that's just personal preference, because this will turn the background into something that is more bluish, but the skin tones will usually be pretty nice if you turn the vibrance up again a little bit. So usually I turn vibrance up a little bit and temperature down a little bit, because this will give a pretty nice pop effect. Then I oftentimes also increase the clarity just a little bit, and then you can do whatever you like. But for me, most of the times, this is actually all I'm going to do. Oftentimes, I'm not really doing much more. And now I'm going to press OK, like so. Now I'm going to press File, Export, Export as. I'll save it on my desktop, finished. And now this right here is the finished thumbnail. And now let me introduce you to probably one of the most important tools when you're working with portraits, especially with portraits of your sister, for example. I would say girls in general. So let me get a portrait of a girl. So let's go over to Unsplash and let's say bad skin portrait. And since I oftentimes edit the portrait of my sister, I have to get rid of a lot of stuff when it comes to skin, for example. So I'm going to download this one, for example. I'm going to move this into Photoshop right here. And now maybe I want to get rid of some of those things. And there exist two different possibilities, but I want to show you the spot healing brush. So I show you the second one. And now you can go over here to the patch tool, essentially. Spot healing brush, patch tool. I usually use the patch tool, but I would say the effect is pretty similar. And now you can just make a circle around a certain area, left click it and drag it over to a clean area. And now you can see it will take a sample from the clean area and replace the original area with that sample from the clean area and make a smooth transition. So it will look kind of right. And now I could just go over them right here. And you can see it looks a lot cleaner already. So I can select it right here, move it over there, and so on. And by doing so, we can get a clean skin. And if you have so many spots on the skin right here, the spot healing brush might not be the best tool anymore. The spot healing brush is especially good if you have a couple of things and you just want to remove them. And in those circumstances, I personally would create curves, would make it really, really bright. Then I would press Ctrl I to invert the layer mask. Then I would take this brush, and something that I've not shown to you up to this point is flow right here. And flow essentially defines how strong the brush is going to be. And I'm going to set it to maybe 1, 2, something like this. So a pretty small value right here. And now this brush will not be that strong. So if I'm going to use 100, you can see I'm just going to make this completely visible. But if I'm going to choose something like 1, you can see it barely has an effect at all. In fact, you can't even see the effect if I just go over it once. But now I could take this brush right here and just go over those spots step by step. And the difference between a spot like that one and the rest of the skin is especially the darkness of the spot. So if I'm going to make those spots a little bit brighter, for example, then it will look a lot better already. But it always also depends on the area. So something like this, I could just go over the spot right here. And after a while, you will probably not really recognize that one anymore. But it's actually really a lot of work. So might take a lot of time, to be honest. And especially for someone like her. But I think you understand how this works. So now, step by step, you could get rid of all of those areas by doing so. Could of course also increase the flow a little bit up to a point where it essentially works for you. And then once it gets too much, you can essentially decrease the flow, of course, once again. But of course, adjusting portraits and especially skin like this takes a lot of time. So yeah, definitely have to be aware of this. But I wanted to show this technique to you because it is something that you might want to use from time to time, especially if you're really focused on portraits, for example, or have a sister like me. And now I want to introduce you to something that is called filters in Photoshop. And there exist a lot of filters, as you can see right here. And in order to use them, you first have to select the layer, then you can go to filters. And right here, you see a lot of filters. And this course is way too short to introduce you to all of those filters. And in fact, it would also be pretty unnecessary because most of the times you will not use those filters. But from time to time, you might watch a tutorial where someone uses one of those filters, or you want to experiment with those filters on your own. And then you know that you can find them right here. So maybe you want to use a blur filter. So something like Gaussian blur, for example, and then you can find it here. This will open this window. And now you can essentially define the strength of this filter by using the radius property, like so, for example. And now you could, for example, create a blur, like so. And I think you understand the idea. And I could, for example, use this blur to just add a blur to a copy of this layer. So Gaussian blur, let me add a little bit of blur, like so. And now I could add a layer mask that is inverted by Alt pressing the layer mask. This will create a black layer mask. And now I could draw over this layer mask, for example, with a normal brush. Give it a little bit less flow. And this is a really dirty way. It is not going to be the best look for something like this, but it would be a pretty fast way to get rid of a lot of the stuff right here. And you can see now it already looks a lot cleaner, I would say. Even though, as I said, it's pretty dirty and it doesn't look perfect. So it's far from perfect. But again, it is a fast way to get a somewhat okay result, I would say. So this is the power of filters. You can use filters to stylize your image, to add certain effects, and so on. And Photoshop also added those neural filters right here. And those ones are pretty strong because they allow you to add a couple of filters by using a single click. So right here, you have the skin smoothing filter, for example. And that one is, for example, kind of nice. So you can just download this filter. So this will take a short time. And there exist a lot of different filters. So makeup transfer, colorize, super zoom, and so on. And you can download this filter. And then you can, for example, add a little bit more blur, a little bit more smoothness to a certain area. And you can see this filter does its best to get smooth skin for you as well. So I want you to be aware that those filters exist. Again, doing it manually most of the times will get you better results, but it's also a lot more time consuming. So whatever you choose is of course up to you. So again, filters can be really useful if you want to add certain effects to an image, for example, like blur, pixelating, stylizing, and so on. It's your favorite NPC, and today I will show you how to go from this to this using Photoshop. I will show you step by step how to get rid of pimples, adjust colors, and use all the tools necessary to get the look you like. So let's get started, guys. Let's now edit this portrait together, and the image will also be in the description in case you want to edit the exact same portrait. First off, I want to start by removing all of those things on the skin. So I'm going to do that by creating a new curves layer. I'm going to put the brightness up right here, and I'm going to invert the entire layer, like so. Now I'm going to take a brush. I decrease the flow to probably around 2 to 3%. And now I'm going to draw on the curves layer to make specific spots a little bit brighter. And the only difference between those spots and the rest of the skin is that those pimples right here are a little bit darker. So by making them a little bit brighter by using curves, we can make it appear even. And this is something that will just take a lot of time. So I have to use a white color, and now I have to paint on the layer mask, like so. And that was the first one. I'm going on to the second one, like so. And for you, I'm actually going to speed this process up because this can really take a lot of time. So approximately 20 minutes later, this is what the result looks like. So now 20 minutes later, this is the result. So this was the before and this is the after. And of course, it's not 100% perfect, but I think you get the idea. And you could spend a lot more time to make literally all of this go away But I'm going to keep it like this for now, because it's enough for this demo. Now I can also use another curve, and I'm going to make this one a little bit darker, like so. Again, I'm going to invert it. And now, if you take a look right here, you also have those spots right here that are a little bit too bright. And now again, you can take the brush and just go over those spots as well to make the skin look even or appear even cleaner, to be precise, like so. And this again is a little bit time consuming. Don't get rid of the highlights because they are important. But if something is a little bit brighter, for example, because the skin is uneven, then you might want to get rid of it, for example, like so. And right here. But this is a lot less for the skin, for example, because of course, most uneven spots come from the pimples. And they are obviously a little bit darker, not brighter. Right here, for example, and right here. And I think you understand how this works. So now you can use the top layer that is darker to get rid of brighter parts, and the bottom layer, which is brighter, to get rid of darker parts, like so. And by doing so, you can get really, really clean skin. And I leave it up to you to spend more time on this if you want to. For me, this right here is kind of right. So I'm going to take all of those layers and I'm going to convert them to a smart object. Now I'm going to press Ctrl J to duplicate this layer. I'm going to use Filter, Blur. I'll use a Gaussian blur right here. Yeah, something like this should be all right. So 8.8, for example. I'm going to press OK. I'm going to alt-click the layer mask to create an inverted layer mask. And now I'm going to take this brush once again with a white color. And I'm going to go over the layer mask right here to make the skin even cleaner at some spots. Right here. And now, even though I didn't spend that much time on the skin, it still looks kind of right, as you can see, or kind of clean, I would say. So now, this is the effect that we're getting. I think this looks a lot better already, like so. So this is the before and this is the after. Now let me also add a little bit of color to the eyes, or make the eyes pop, to be precise. In order to do so, I'm again going to use a curves adjustment layer and make this one a lot brighter. I'm going to invert the layer mask. I'm again going to use the white brush with a flow of 5. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. And now I'm going to go and add some light to the bottom of the iris right here, like so. And I can make everything a little bit brighter, but especially the bottom part will be a lot brighter, like so. And this will make the eyes pop, as you can see. I'm going to do the exact same for the other side. So everything will be a little bit brighter, but especially the bottom part will be a lot brighter, like so. And this bottom part especially will make the eyes pop a lot more, like this. Now I'm also going to make the outer part a little bit wider, because this will increase the contrast, and more contrast makes something pop out a little more, like so. And of course the exact same on the other side, like so. And now I can show you the before and the after. So before and after. And in my opinion, this looks a lot better already. I can also use hue saturation. I'm going to increase the saturation for everything. Now I'm going to invert the mask. And again, I take the brush and I go over my eyes with a flow of 5 to make my eyes pop out a little more, because now they are a little more saturated, as you can see. So this is the before and this is the after. It's up to you what you prefer, but I think this here looks kinda alright. And maybe the curves effect is a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to reduce it by a little bit. Like so, and maybe actually even a little more, because it was really strong. And this was before, this was after. Now, if we take a look at the background, we could also add a tealish color overlay to that one. So I'm going to convert everything to a smart object again. I'm going to duplicate this layer. I'm going to say select subject, like so. It will select the subject. So now it has my subject. I'm going to press the layer mask to create a layer mask that only contains the person. So now we only have the person right here. And now I can just create a tealish background on the second layer. So right here on this one. and later on I'm going to activate the top layer, and this will contain my person. So I'm going to say selective color, for example, and now to my neutrals, I can add a little bit of cyan, for example, like so. And let me also activate the top layer so we really see what this is doing. So I'm going to add a little bit more cyan right here, maybe a little bit more blue as well, like this. And you can see this makes my subject already pop a lot more. Maybe a little more blue, a little more cyan as well. And I think this looks a lot better already. Now let's also target the skin maybe, or the person in general. And let's add a little bit of vibrance to the person. So I'm going to say, give me color and vibrance. I'm going to create a clipping mask for color and vibrance to our person, because I only want to affect this person right here. And now I'm going to add a little bit more vibrance to our person, like so. And now I think all of this looks kind of right already. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to convert all of this to a smart object. Now I'm going to press filter by selecting the layer. So filter, camera raw filter, like so. And now I'm just going to test out a couple of different styles. So maybe I'm going to decrease the temperature. I'm going to increase the vibrance a little bit, like so. Maybe I try to play around with the highlights a little bit, but I think they're kind of right already. Now we can also make the lips pop a little more by going to the color mixer. I'm going to select saturation, and for the reds, I'm going to increase the saturation just a little bit, like so. I think also my eyes are in the green range, so I could also increase the greens right here a little bit, which should make the eyes pop a little more. And maybe the aquas, yeah, but I think this is kind of right. Now I'm going to leave the aquas to 0. And now this here is the finished image. So I'm going to press OK. And now this right here is the before, and this right here is the after. So again, before and after. Of course, it's personal preference. You could also argue that the first portrait is kind of right and pretty nice already. And a lot in the end comes down to taste. This here is really stylized, and some people might not even like this look. But I think you understand how you can get the look that you like. And in the end, you can just use the tools I showed you to create whatever you prefer.